Welcome to the True Crime for Sleeping channel. If you're new here, be sure to hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment letting us know where in the world you're watching from. Now, settle in and get comfortable as we unfold another chilling true crime story told slowly and calmly, perfect for those late hours. Fairmont, Ohio, was the kind of small town that most people passed through on the way to somewhere else. Nestled among gently rolling hills and quiet two-lane roads, it was the kind of place where the loudest sound on a summer afternoon might be the creak of a porch swing or the rustle of wind through the tall stalks of corn. Everyone knew everyone, or at least they thought they did. At the edge of town sat Fairmont Orchard, a sprawling patch of land once owned by the Holloway family. Long since abandoned, the orchard had become a local legend. Kids would dare each other to run through it at night, whispering stories about witches, bootleggers, and more sinister things buried beneath its soil. Most adults rolled their eyes at the tales, calling them nothing more than the kind of spooky folklore that always seemed to cling to places forgotten by time. But everything changed on a muggy afternoon in July 1999, when a group of surveyors working on behalf of a real estate development company stumbled across something they couldn't explain. At first it looked like a pile of rocks, half buried under a collapsed shed near the center of the orchard. But one of the men, Ben McAllister, a local father of two, noticed something off. The rocks weren't shaped like anything natural. He brushed more dirt away and saw the unmistakable curve of a human jawbone, bleached by time and speckled with dry earth. The police were called immediately, and soon the orchard was swarming with activity. Over the next 48 hours, investigators uncovered not one, but multiple sets of remains. Some were complete skeletons, others partial, shattered and scattered beneath years of decay and neglect. At the end of the initial dig, they had counted 7 bodies, all hidden in a makeshift grave, no more than 100 yards from the edge of the nearest farmhouse. The town reeled. Nothing like this had ever happened in Fairmont. Local media ran non-stop coverage, and theories bloomed like wildflowers, everything from a forgotten cult to a serial killer using the orchard as a dumping ground. But behind closed doors, investigators feared something more calculated, more intimate. The remains were old, at least 20 years, some even older, and remarkably well concealed. Someone had taken their time. Among the first to be publicly identified was a 17-year-old girl named Lila Rourke, missing since 1981. Her disappearance had been a local tragedy, overshadowed in time by others, but never truly forgotten by her family. When the news broke that her body had been found, her sister Marianne, now in her 50s, stood at the edge of the crime scene, clutching a faded photo of Lila from the year she disappeared. She said she was going to the orchard to take pictures. Marianne whispered to the reporter beside her. She loved that place, said it felt like stepping into a dream. She never came home. Lila's case was just the beginning. Over the next several weeks, forensic teams worked tirelessly to identify the other remains. 2 more were linked to local missing persons cases from the late 70s and early 80s, young adults who had vanished without a trace. Another body belonged to a transient man who had occasionally passed through Fairmont, last seen in 1984 near the train tracks. But the most chilling revelation came when police discovered an old rotting suitcase buried a few feet away from the gravesite. Inside were personal items, a rusted pocket watch, a child's toy, a locket containing a photograph of a young couple, and several bundles of old Polaroids, many of them stained or curled with age, but still legible. The photographs showed people, some smiling, some clearly frightened. All of them appeared to be taken in the orchard, or near it. Most haunting of all were the last few images, blurry shots of what looked like people tied to wooden beams in the barn, faces obscured or turned away, their bodies limp. The barn, long since collapsed, had been overlooked by the developers and locals alike. But when authorities returned to search it thoroughly, they discovered something else buried beneath the rubble, an old notebook, water-damaged but partially intact. Scribbled inside were entries in a jagged, hurried hand, sometimes incoherent, sometimes calm and almost poetic. I watched her through the trees again today. She likes the way the sun falls on the apples. I think she'll be next. Detective Gerald Avery, a seasoned investigator brought in from Columbus to help lead the task force, would later say this was the moment the case shifted from tragic to horrifying. "We weren't looking at random acts of violence," he explained at a press conference. "This was premeditated. This was personal. Someone in this community knew these people. Someone lured them here, and someone buried them, believing they'd never be found. But by 1999, whoever had done it was long gone, or so it seemed. No fingerprints were found, and DNA testing at the time was still limited. The notebook offered no names, no confessions, just cryptic musings and veiled threats. For years the case sat cold, a gruesome mystery without resolution. It would take over 2 decades, and the sudden interest of a true crime podcaster, for new light to be cast on the shadows of Fairmont Orchard. Her name was Elise Duvall. Known for her slow, haunting narrative style, Elise had built a modest but loyal following for her podcast Midnight Harvest. In the summer of 2023, she aired a 3-part series titled The Orchard Files, revisiting the unsolved Fairmont case. Drawing from old police reports, interviews with surviving family members, and her own investigation, Elise stirred up interest that the local authorities hadn't seen in years. But she also stirred something else. 3 weeks after the final episode aired, a package arrived at her P.O. box. No return address. Inside was an envelope marked simply, "You missed one." Alongside it was a photograph, aged, creased and chilling. It showed the orchard as it had once been, healthy trees casting shadows across the land. In the corner of the frame was a figure, almost too small to notice. Someone standing just at the edge of the barn, their face obscured by what looked like a burlap sack. Pinned to the back of the photograph was a note, typed on an old typewriter. "They'll all come back if you know where to look." It wasn't long before the presence of Detective Mara Ellison became routine in Fairmont. Locals, some suspicious, some eager, watched her every move with the kind of guarded fascination small towns reserve for outsiders. Her SUV was often parked outside City Hall or in front of the diner on Main Street. She was always asking questions, quiet, methodical ones. What had seemed like an isolated archaeological discovery had morphed into a possible cold case. And no one in Fairmont liked the idea of old bones whispering secrets. Mara kept her office in the back of the local sheriff's department, a converted break room that smelled faintly of old coffee and lemon cleaner. On the bulletin board above her desk were pinned photographs of the orchard remains, the rusted crucifix, and a growing list of missing persons from the surrounding counties dating back to the 1960s. She had mapped each disappearance with red pushpins on a faded county map, the pins forming a loose semicircle around Fairmont. The orchard, with its buried remains, sat in the center. The orchard's owner, Glenn Roswell, had been less than helpful. He was a wiry, hard-eyed man in his late 70s, with sun-darkened skin and a smoker's rafts. When she'd asked if he knew anything about the bones, he had merely shrugged and muttered something about damn kids always burying trouble. "Have you owned the property long?" Mara had asked. "Since '73, he'd replied. "Before that belonged to my uncle. He left it to me when he passed." "And your uncle, what was his name?" "Jeremiah Roswell." She had scribbled the name down, something about it scratched at the edge of her memory. Jeremiah Roswell. He had died in 1973, the same year the disappearances stopped. Later that week she tracked down one of the oldest residents in Fairmont, a woman named Lorraine Whitaker. Lorraine lived in a small weathered cottage at the end of Walnut Street, and had been the town's librarian for nearly 5 decades before retiring. When Mara arrived, Lorraine invited her in with a polite smile, and offered chamomile tea in delicate porcelain cups. "The orchard," Lorraine said slowly, after Mara asked about the Roswell property, "used to be a place where children weren't allowed to go. Even in the 50s, folks whispered about strange things out there." "Like what?" "Well," Lorraine hesitated, looking into her tea. "There was a story about a girl who vanished in '59. Her name was Bonnie Carver. She was 11, had blonde hair always in pigtails. Walked to school every morning down Harvest Road. One day she didn't come home. They searched for her for weeks. Bloodhounds. Helicopters. Nothing. Just, was she the only one?" Lorraine shook her head, slow and solemn. "There were others, But Bonnie was the first I remember. Over the years more went missing. Never many, just one every year or two. Always children or teens. Some from Fairmont, some just passing through. But the common thread, she tapped her teacup with one frail finger. They were last seen near the orchard. Mara left Lorraine's cottage with the hair on her arms standing on end. If the woman was right, the orchard had been a graveyard for decades, right under the town's nose. At night, Mara reread the files in her motel room, the hum of the ceiling fan above barely masking the silence. There were no case files from the 60s or 70s. No central database covered that far back, unless she requested state archives. But there were newspaper clippings. She poured through microfilm in the town library, piecing together scraps. Local girl still missing, teen vanishes on way to dance, boy's bicycle found in ditch. All within a mile radius of the Roswell orchard. No arrests, no leads. The rusted crucifix continued to nag at her. She took it to a local antiquities dealer named Saul Mathers, who ran a cluttered little shop called the Keepsake Nest on the outskirts of town. Saul was in his 60s, and wore thick bifocals perched on the end of his nose. He examined the crucifix with gloved hands, turning it slowly under the light. "This isn't your typical Catholic piece," he said. "Too crude. Handmade. See here." He pointed to the back. "That's not Latin or English. What is it?" Mara asked. "All German, I think. Roughly translates to God sees beneath the soil." That chilled her. She asked him to write it down. Also, Saul added, squinting, "This looks like iron, not steel. Likely made in the early 20th century, maybe even late 1800s. Definitely pre-war." She thanked him, then drove back to the orchard, parking at the far end, near where the first bones were found. She stood under the canopy of trees, watching the wind move through the leaves. Somewhere beneath her feet, someone had buried children. Dozens, maybe more. And no one had noticed, or worse, no one had said a word. The next break came 2 days later, when a tip came in from a man named Roger Linton, a retired firefighter, who now volunteered at the local historical society. He'd been organizing old photo albums, and came across a group picture taken in 1961 at a community harvest fair. In the photo, a group of children stood smiling beside a man in a wide-brimmed hat with a crooked grin, and a collie at his side. The caption underneath read, "Children's Safety Parade, hosted by J. Roswell, Jeremiah Roswell." Mara stared at the image for a long time. The man's eyes didn't match the grin. Something in his posture, the way he held the dog's leash tight, the slight tilt of his head felt wrong. She took the photo and scanned it, sending it to her contact at the State Bureau. That evening, she knocked on Glenn Roswell's door again. He answered with a beer in one hand and a cigarette in the other, his eyes wary. "I want to talk about your uncle," she said. "Jeremiah Roswell." He grunted and stepped aside. The inside of the house smelled of stale beer, motor oil, and something faintly sour. "He's been dead near 50 years, Glenn muttered. "What's to talk about?" Mara took out the photo, and laid it on the kitchen table. "Do you recognize anyone in this picture?" Glenn stared. For a moment he said nothing. "Then that's him. Uncle Jerry. Always had that mutt with him. Buddy, I think. He used to take kids on hayrides. Said he liked the laughter. Did anyone ever accuse him of anything?" Glenn snorted. "Back then? Nah. People minded their own business. I remember rumors after Bonnie disappeared, but nothing came of it." "Was he religious?" "Not exactly. Claimed to talk to God sometimes. Always said he was chosen for something, but my folks just thought he was eccentric." Mara leaned forward. "Glenn, I need to ask you something, and I need the truth. Did you ever see your uncle do anything strange out at the orchard?" His eyes flicked away. "I saw him dig," he muttered. "At night. Said he was planting seeds. But I never saw trees grow in those spots." She didn't press further. Not yet. Glenn was twitchy, on edge, and she didn't want to scare him off. But what he'd said was enough. Night digging, children disappearing. A man who said he talked to God. There was something buried deeper in this town than just bones, and she was starting to uncover it. Later that night, Mara sat in her SUV outside the orchard again. The moon was bright, casting silver light across the rows of fruit trees. She pulled out the photo of Jeremiah Roswell again. His smile seemed darker now. She turned it over, finding a note scribbled in pencil, "Where the wind dies, the orchard weeps." She stared at it, chilled. Somewhere in Fairmont, an old evil had festered, and if she wasn't careful, it might still be watching. The morning fog rolled across the orchard like a living thing. It curled low to the ground, swirled between the tree trunks, and wrapped itself around the legs of Detective Mara Ellison, as she stood once more near the flagged dig site. She could smell damp earth, the decay of fallen apples rotting in the grass, and something subtler, mildewed cloth maybe. A suggestion of age and memory, like stepping into a room sealed off for decades. Behind her, forensic anthropologist Dr. Theo Marks knelt near the pit, his gloved hands brushing dirt from another small pale femur. "That's the seventh distinct individual," he said, not looking up. "All juveniles. Based on growth plate fusion, I'd say ages range from 6 to 12. 7 children." Mara swallowed, the number crashing over her like cold water. 7 sets of remains in one corner of the orchard. How many more were scattered across the rest of the acreage? 10, 20. "Are they buried uniformly?" she asked. Theo nodded slightly. "Shallow graves. No markers. All face down, no signs of clothing preserved." "Face down," Mara echoed. "It's not uncommon. Could be ritual, could be symbolic, could also mean someone didn't want to look them in the eye again." That made her shiver. She looked out across the rows of trees. The orchard stretched for acres, its southern end bordered by a line of poplars that looked like sentries. For years it had simply been farmland, a quiet place, tucked behind the town like an afterthought. Now it felt like a graveyard. Back at the sheriff's office, Mara sat down with Deputy Jacob Voss, a lanky, mild-mannered man who'd grown up in Fairmont and joined the force straight out of the local community college. He'd taken an interest in the investigation, and had been combing old archives at her request. "I found something weird," he said, flipping through his notebook. "There's a ledger from Fairmont's Public Works Department from the early 1970s. It shows a record of pesticide deliveries for the orchard. One delivery in particular, from 1971, stood out." "What about it?" "It was made to someone named Charles Dunst, not Jeremiah Roswell, but according to property records, Jeremiah still owned the orchard at the time. Could have been a farmhand." Mara offered. "Right, that's what I thought. But I ran the name Charles Dunst through some of the old newspaper archives. Turns out, he was arrested in 1963 for allegedly abducting a teenage girl in Ohio. Charges were dropped due to lack of evidence, but he left the state shortly after. No record of where he went." "And you think he came here?" "Possible. The name reappears in 1975 in a church registry. St. Elias Lutheran, just outside of Fairmont. He was listed as a member, but again no details. He disappears after that." Mara tapped her fingers against her notepad. A new name, a new possible accomplice. Could he have worked under Jeremiah? Maybe. If Jeremiah was involved in the disappearances, Dunst might have been part of it. Or he could have taken over after Jeremiah died. That was the part that troubled her. Jeremiah Roswell died in 1973. If the killing stopped with his death, it suggested he was working alone. But what if someone else had quietly continued? She glanced at the map again, red pins clustered around the orchard. The last known disappearance was in 1972, Bonnie Carver. After that, silence. But bones didn't lie. The remains they'd uncovered so far couldn't all predate 1972. Some were in far better condition. Theo had even noted that 2 skeletons had intact dental fillings, using a composite material only common in the early 1980s. Someone else had kept burying bodies, long after Jeremiah's death. The next day, Mara revisited Lorraine Whitaker. The former librarian welcomed her back with a thin-lipped smile and fresh tea. Her hands trembled more than before, and her eyes had a faraway look to them. "More questions?" she asked. Yes, Mara said gently. Do you remember anyone named Charles Dunst? Lorraine blinked, thought. Then Charlie Dunst. Yes, I do. He worked as a handyman around town for a while. Lived in a little shack on the north end of the orchard, if I'm remembering right. Kept to himself. Didn't go to church. Didn't come to town events. Was he close with Jeremiah Roswell? A pause. I think they were companions, in a way. Not friendly, but bound together. Like two crows perched on the same branch. People found them unsettling. Do you remember anything else? Anything strange about him? Lorraine leaned back in her chair, eyes flickering with memory. There were rumors. About a boy named Eric Lansing. He went missing in 1968. Folks said they saw Charlie Dunst talking to him near the orchard gate the day before. But nothing came of it. The sheriff back then, what was his name? Carter. He didn't pursue it. Did Dunst disappear after Jeremiah's death? Not right away. I saw him a few times at the edge of town, but then he was just gone. Some said he moved north. Some said he never left. Mara thanked her again, heart pounding. If Dunst hadn't left, where had he gone? Was he still here, hiding in plain sight? She requested permission to conduct a deeper search of the property, and returned the following morning with 2 forensic techs and a ground-penetrating radar unit. Glenn Roswell, tight-lipped and suspicious, allowed them access but hovered at a distance, cigarette permanently wedged between his fingers. The orchard was large, but they focused on the northern quadrant, closest to the poplar line Lorraine had mentioned. By mid-afternoon, the radar had picked up anomalies. At least 6 of them. Same depth as the other graves, the tech confirmed. Mara stood silently, as the sun dipped behind the trees. 6 more bodies. Each grave a secret. A name buried under soil and silence. She wondered how long Glenn had lived on this land, walking past the dead, eating the fruit that grew from above their bones. Start digging, she said. That night, she received a call from Deputy Voss. Got something you'll want to see, he said. Meet me at the church. St. Elias Lutheran sat on a small hill just east of Fairmont. It was a plain white building, with a modest bell tower, and a cemetery out back. Voss met her near the rear entrance, flashlight in hand. I went through old parish records again, he said. Most were routine, baptisms, marriages. But then I found this. He held up a brittle yellowed ledger, open to a page marked 1974. A series of names had been crossed out in red ink. All but one, Charles Dunst, status transferred. Mara asked. According to church tradition, that means the member was moved to another parish. But there's no destination listed. Just this. He flipped the page. Tucked into the spine was a small envelope. Inside was a Polaroid photo, faded but intact. A cabin in the woods. Behind it, just visible through the trees, was a clearing. In the clearing stood 7 wooden crosses. Mara felt a jolt through her spine. By the next morning, she and Voss were searching county land records for any mention of cabins matching the photo. It didn't take long. A parcel of land, 2 miles north of the orchard, had been deeded to C. Dunst in 1971. It had since fallen into tax default, and reverted to the county. They hiked there on foot. Thick brush and overgrowth made driving impossible. The cabin stood just as it had in the photo. Time had not been kind. The roof sagged in the middle, and one window had caved in completely. But the door still stood. Inside, the air was stale. Dust blanketed everything. A wood-burning stove sat rusted in the corner, and along one wall, books were stacked in uneven towers. Most were religious texts, obscure and yellowed with age. Mara skimmed the titles. The Hidden Word, Blood of the Earth, A Shepherd's Path. There was a journal too. She opened it, flipping past pages filled with tight, meticulous handwriting. The entries were cryptic, almost poetic. The orchard weeps, and I must tend it. Children are light before the fall. He watches beneath the soil. The last entry was dated October 14th, 1985. She came again last night. Blonde hair, no eyes.
I told her to leave, but she stood at the end of the bed. Jeremiah was right. The orchard never forgets. Mara closed the journal, hands trembling. Outside, the sun dipped lower, shadows stretched through the trees. And beyond the cabin, in the overgrown clearing, stood 7 wooden crosses. Faded, splintered, but still upright. She counted them twice. Then she called the team. The silence in the clearing, behind the cabin, felt deeper than nightfall. Detective Mara Ellison stood motionless among the tangled undergrowth, flashlight beam fixed on the 7 crude wooden crosses. They stood at odd angles, some leaning, others half swallowed by vines and brush. Time had weathered them, but each still bore a carved initial. MTL, JKABRW SPE. L. She didn't need a database to guess what they stood for. These were initials of the missing. The names they'd chased through old police reports. The ones engraved in faded "Have you seen me?" posters that once clung to telephone poles and school bulletin boards. Bonnie Carver, Eric Lansing, Rachel Whitmore, Timothy Lowe. It was all here. A ledger in wood and moss, carved by someone who had either mourned or mocked. Dr. Theo Marks arrived an hour later with the excavation crew. They set to work beneath the dim light of portable rigs, the kind used at night crash scenes and rural digs. The soft earth gave way easily, rich and dark from years of undisturbed decay. With each layer peeled back, the orchard surrendered another of its ghosts. 3 more juvenile skeletons were uncovered that night, each buried in a fetal position, each grave with no accompanying items, no clothing, no personal belongings, just bones. The expressions on the crew's faces remained professional, but Mara saw the same hollowed look in all of them. They were quietly shaken. Something about these graves felt different than the others. Less like hasty concealment and more like a ritual, like the graves had meaning, not just secrecy. Back in town, the story was no longer a whisper. Local news vans had arrived in the early morning, their antennae rising like metal stalks. By noon, a national outlet had picked up the story. Fairmont's Orchard of Bones. The headline read, "Sensationalism cloaked in concern." Reporters clustered at the orchard's edge like hungry birds, kept at bay by yellow tape and a line of exhausted deputies. Sheriff Nick Aldridge returned from his medical leave to stand before the cameras and deliver a carefully measured statement. At this time, we can confirm that 13 sets of remains have been recovered from the Roswell orchard and surrounding properties. Identification is ongoing. We believe these individuals disappeared between the late 1960s and mid-1980s. Investigation is active and ongoing. He didn't say what everyone in town already suspected, that more bodies might still be found, that someone had been burying children across 2 decades, without being caught, that someone might still be alive. Later that evening, Mara sat in the station's small break room, staring at a whiteboard cluttered with names, dates, and lines of red string. A name had begun to dominate her thoughts, one that had floated on the edge of every witness interview and archival document: Charles Dunst. The man with no family, no criminal charges, but always hovering near tragedy. He had been a shadow behind Jeremiah Roswell, then a recluse after his death. No official record of employment, but mentioned often enough in church documents, grainy photographs, and rumor. And now this cabin, his handwriting, his journal. He's the thread. Mara muttered to herself. He's the one who kept it going. Deputy Voss entered quietly behind her, setting a manila folder on the table. "You'll want to see this," he said. "We got a hit from the regional dental database. One of the sets of remains, juvenile female, maybe 10 years old, matched to records from a missing girl in Montana. Name's Emily Ross. Vanished while on vacation with her family in 1983. They were camping in Idaho. She wandered off during a rest stop, and was never seen again." Mara opened the file. There was the photo. A soft-faced girl with freckles and curly hair. Her smile uneven, like she was holding back laughter. Montana to Oregon. Mara murmured. "That's hundreds of miles. Someone brought her here," Voss said. "Across state lines." Which meant this wasn't just local. It was broader, bigger. Whoever had been doing this hadn't just preyed on Fairmont. They had cast a wider net. The forensic team continued their work at the cabin site throughout the week. Behind the crosses, in a patch of flattened brush, they discovered what looked like a collapsed cellar entrance. Old boards had rotted away, and tree roots had curled down into the opening like fingers. When they pried it open, the air that spilled out was thick and cold. Inside was a narrow staircase, leading into a shallow underground room, no more than 15 feet square. A single bulb hung from a wire, long dead. The walls were covered in children's drawings, faded, crayon-smeared sheets pinned side by side, stick figures, houses, trees. Some depicted children with their hands raised, some with what looked like tears. A single mattress lay in the corner, stained and brittle. On a shelf were jars, each labeled with a name and a date. They were filled with teeth. Over 20 jars. Mara stared, her breath stuck in her throat. This wasn't just a killer. This was someone who documented, who curated, who kept trophies. It was systematic, cold, calculated. She thought of the journal again. The orchard weeps. This place wasn't just burial ground. It had been a holding chamber. A place where they were taken first, before being interred beneath the apple trees. DNA testing over the following weeks confirmed what they feared. The remains included children missing from across 4 states: Oregon, Idaho, Montana and Washington. Each one had vanished under ambiguous or unexplained circumstances, some from campsites, some from schoolyards, some from rest stops. There had never been any known link between the cases, until now. Reporters seized on the theory. Roswell and Dunst, a 2-man operation. One headline blared. Another speculated about satanic cults. But Mara knew better. The truth, as always, was quieter and harder to stomach. This had been the work of deeply damaged men who used rural isolation, social indifference, and the inertia of law enforcement across state lines to cover their tracks. Jeremiah may have started it, but Charles Dunst had ensured it endured.
Yet one mystery still lingered. What happened to Dunst? No body had been found in or near the cabin. No remains, no trace, just his journal, his trophies, and his crimes. Was he dead, or had he simply moved on again? Then, one evening, a call came in. A woman in Bellingham, Washington, over 400 miles north, reported something strange. Her elderly neighbor, who lived alone, had been taken by ambulance to the hospital after suffering a stroke. He'd gone into cardiac arrest in the ER and died within an hour. No next of kin, no identification beyond a library card. But during intake, the paramedics had found something else in his home, a notebook filled with names, dozens of them, and at the very bottom of the list, scribbled in shaky, failing handwriting, was the phrase, "The orchard has stopped weeping. I have nothing left to give it." The man's name, as determined by fingerprint analysis, was Charles Dunst. He had been living under the alias Harold Beck since the mid-90s. Neighbors described him as quiet, odd. He never allowed children near his home. He once called animal control on a neighbor's daughter for walking her dog near his fence. No one had any idea who he really was. No one ever does, until it's too late. In the months that followed, the orchard was cordoned off permanently. Glenn Roswell, publicly exonerated, but privately ruined, abandoned the property. The town voted to purchase the land from him, using a state historical preservation grant. The intention was to convert it into a memorial, quiet, sacred, solemn. Mara Ellison was promoted to chief investigator of the county. She kept a photo of the orchard in her new office, not because she wanted to remember the case, but because she couldn't forget it. The trees in the photo looked beautiful in bloom, their branches heavy with white flowers, but all she could see were the graves beneath them. The orchard would bloom again next spring. It always did, but Fairmont would never be the same, and some trees, no matter how healthy their fruit, grow from poisoned soil. The shallow grave at Birch Hollow, it was the kind of place you drove past on your way to somewhere else. The town of Elmridge sat quietly tucked between long-forgotten byways in upstate New York. a town of cracked sidewalks, shuttered diners, and locals who had long since run out of stories to tell. The people there kept to themselves, not out of coldness, but out of habit. Generations had lived and died in Elmridge without much fanfare, which is why when 24-year-old Dana Carlyle vanished after her late shift at the Birch Hollow Diner, no one noticed at first. She wasn't a tourist or a college student passing through. She had lived in Elmridge her whole life, the youngest of three, raised by a single mother in a weather-beaten house on Hemlock Street. Dana was polite, punctual, and practical. She'd never even been late for a shift. Her disappearance became public knowledge only after her mother, Patricia, filed a missing persons report with the Elmridge Police Department on the morning of July 6, 1998. Dana had worked the July 4th holiday shift at the diner and was last seen around 11:30 p.m. that night, according to the restaurant's night cook, Tommy Geller. She told him she was heading straight home. She never made it. At first, police assumed she'd simply taken off, left town, needed a break, maybe even got into a car with someone. But that theory didn't hold up. Dana had no car of her own. Her purse and house keys were found still locked inside her locker at the diner. Her last paycheck was uncashed. Her bank account remained untouched. Her shift apron still hung on the hook where she always left it. Patricia Carlyle pushed harder. She spoke to every officer who would listen. She told them Dana had no reason to run. No fights, no boyfriends, no drug problems. She was saving money to enroll in community college that fall. She had plans. Detective Lou Ramirez took the case seriously from the beginning. A former NYPD homicide detective who had moved to Elmridge after his wife passed away, Ramirez was known for his quiet demeanor and relentless follow-up. He started by retracing Dana's steps that night. The Birch Hollow Diner sat off Route 27, its parking lot dimly lit and surrounded on one side by thick woods. No CCTV, no security guard. The staff closed up together, but Dana was the last to leave. Tommy Geller had left by 11:35 p.m. The waitress who worked with Dana that night, Jackie Madsen, left around the same time. No one saw Dana after that. A canvass of the nearby area turned up no clues. The woods behind the diner were searched twice, both by foot and with dogs. Nothing. Not a shoe, not a thread, not a single sign she had ever left that building. Ramirez found the lack of evidence unnerving. He interviewed all the employees at the diner. Most had worked there for years. A few were teenagers working summer jobs. Everyone said the same thing. Dana was quiet, polite, and had no enemies. Except perhaps for one. A name came up more than once in whispered tones: Jack Laramie. Laramie was a handyman in his mid-40s who had done occasional repair work for the diner. He was described as weird by one of the waitresses, and off by another. Jackie Madsen remembered Dana mentioning once that Jack had offered her a ride home after a rainstorm and she'd refused. He gave her the creeps, Jackie said. Ramirez visited Laramie at his cabin, deep in the woods north of town. The man lived in a barely functional trailer, surrounded by rusting car parts, old tools and two aggressive dogs chained to a tree. Laramie was cooperative but distant. She never got in my truck, he told Ramirez. Saw her working that night. Said good night. That's it. His alibi was shaky. He claimed he'd driven home after dropping off some tools at the diner and watched a VHS tape until falling asleep. No one could confirm it. Ramirez noted his tone, calm but mechanical, like he'd rehearsed the story. Still, there was no evidence tying him to Dana's disappearance. No witnesses, no fingerprints, no motive. Ramirez tried digging into Laramie's background but found little. A petty theft charge from the 80s, a disorderly conduct ticket from a bar fight, but nothing violent. Nothing serious enough to hold him. Weeks passed, the town's interest waned. Other stories took over. The county fair, a lightning strike that burned down an abandoned barn, a minor political scandal. Dana Carlyle faded into the kind of mystery Elmridge didn't want to solve. A ghost in a town too tired to care. Then on August 19th, 6 weeks after Dana vanished, a hiker and his teenage son discovered a shallow depression in the woods 2 miles east of the Birch Hollow Diner. The boy had stumbled over something hard while kicking through a patch of ivy. It turned out to be bone. The area was quickly secured by police. Excavation began early the next morning. Within hours they uncovered a nearly intact skeleton in a shallow grave. The remains were wrapped in an old bedsheet. Dental records confirmed what Patricia Carlyle already feared. It was Dana. Her death was ruled a homicide. She had suffered blunt force trauma to the back of the skull. No drugs or alcohol were found in the toxicology. No signs of sexual assault. She had been hit once, possibly from behind, and left in the woods like garbage. The location of the grave disturbed Ramirez. It was remote, but not inaccessible. It was close enough that someone local, someone who knew the area, could have done it quickly. It was also land that belonged, coincidentally, to Jack Laramie's cousin. Laramie denied knowing the land belonged to a relative. He said he hadn't been out there in years. He denied everything, but suspicion wasn't enough. The sheet wrapped around Dana's body was tested for DNA. Results were inconclusive. Soil samples yielded nothing. A few strands of hair were found, but they were too degraded for a match. The case stalled again. Patricia Carlyle refused to stop. She began distributing flyers again, giving interviews to local news outlets, even starting a small website to track updates. A few anonymous tips came in, but none credible. Then in September, a breakthrough. An old employee from the Birch Hollow diner, an ex-dishwasher named Dennis Cole, reached out to police. He'd left town shortly after Dana went missing, moved south to Pennsylvania. He told Ramirez he was ready to talk now, because he'd always felt guilty. "I saw her get into a truck," he said. According to Cole, he'd gone back to the diner late that night to retrieve a jacket he'd left behind. As he pulled into the lot, he saw Dana standing beside an old blue pickup. She was talking to someone in the driver's seat. He didn't see her get in, but when he came back out 2 minutes later, the truck and Dana were gone. Cole hadn't told anyone because he was on probation at the time and didn't want to be dragged into an investigation. But the detail that caught Ramirez's attention was the truck, an old Ford F-150 with a busted right taillight. That matched a description of Laramie's vehicle, which had been sitting on his property when Ramirez first visited. Armed with this new testimony, Ramirez revisited Laramie. The man's tone had changed. He was less calm now, defensive. He denied owning a blue truck, but a search warrant proved otherwise. In his garage under a tarp, police found a Ford F-150 with a cracked taillight. The vehicle had been partially dismantled, its license plates removed, but it was there. A luminol test revealed faint traces of blood in the truck bed. Still, it wasn't enough. The DNA was too degraded to make a definitive match. No confession, no eyewitness placing Laramie behind the wheel that night. Cole hadn't seen the driver's face. The DA wouldn't press charges, not yet. Ramirez was furious. Patricia Carlyle was devastated. And Jack Laramie, he moved away, quietly, without a trace. But sometimes the past doesn't stay buried, because 5 years later, another woman disappeared. And this time, the town would learn just how deep the secrets of Birch Hollow really went. The air around Birch Hollow grew colder in the days after the discovery. Rain drizzled intermittently, turning the dirt path into a muddy trail, the once innocent forest now stained with the presence of death. Officer Will Kramer stood with arms folded just beyond the police tape, eyes fixed on the small clearing that had once seemed so innocuous. The forensics team worked slowly, carefully, with every spade of earth revealing more than the last. By the time the 5th day of excavation began, the team had unearthed more than just a single skeleton. The initial body, partially uncovered by the dog, had been a shallow burial, rushed, careless. But just 2 feet away, another set of bones emerged, smaller this time, a femur child-sized, then a second skull. By week's end, they had 6 partial skeletons. The news swept the town like wildfire. No one wanted to believe it. 6 bodies in the woods just beyond their homes. It wasn't just a grave, it was a graveyard. The coroner, Dr. Marcy Hill, made a grim announcement that chilled even the most hardened officers. "These remains date back at least a decade," she said quietly at a press conference.
her gloved hands trembling as she held up a composite sketch based on the first skull. We believe the victims were all female, aged between 9 and 16, no identities yet, just bones and guesses. Rumors exploded on social media, speculation spreading faster than facts. Some said it was a serial killer from the 90s, someone who'd never been caught. Others whispered about missing girls from neighboring counties, their names resurfacing after years in cold case folders. Parents began locking their doors again. Old fears resurfaced. Detective Kendra Doyle wasn't one for ghost stories or folklore, but something about Birch Hollow gnawed at her. She stood in the tiny sheriff's office, examining the map of Pinebrook County. Red dots marked the homes of the families who had reported girls missing between 1995 and 2008. Girls who had vanished without a trace, often after school or from the edge of town. When plotted on the map, the dots formed a crude circle, and Birch Hollow sat directly in the center. "See this," she said, tapping the map as Kramer walked in, a coffee in hand. "They're all within driving distance. 30 minutes tops." Kramer squinted. "You think they're connected?" "I do," she said. "And I don't think whoever did this just stopped. They either died, got arrested for something else, or they're still out there." The town's archives hadn't been digitized yet, so Kendra took it upon herself to visit the old records building on her day off. There, between crumbling newspaper clippings and yellowing police files, she found the first real lid. A name kept appearing: Marla Jessup. In 2003, Marla Jessup was a 14-year-old who vanished after a volleyball practice. Her bike had been found leaning against a chain-link fence 2 blocks from Birch Hollow's entrance. The original report had been handled by a now-retired officer named George Lemley, who'd written that Marla likely ran away after an argument with her mother. No evidence, no search dogs, no urgency. Kendra slammed the file shut and cursed under her breath. She knew what happened in towns like this. Missing white girls got attention if their families had the right last names. Marla's didn't. Her parents worked long shifts at the paper mill, spoke little at press conferences, and never held candlelight vigils. Their daughter's disappearance was swallowed by silence. Kendra knocked on the Jessup residence late that afternoon. The house sat near the edge of town, one of those slumping cottages with paint peeling and a screen door that hung slightly crooked. Marla's mother, Dolores, answered. She looked older than her years, worn and weary. "You hear about the bones?" Dolores said before Kendra could speak. "Yes, ma'am. I was hoping you'd be willing to talk about Marla." The woman hesitated, then opened the door wider. Inside, the walls were still lined with photos. Marla in braids, at a birthday party, holding a softball trophy. Dolores poured them tea without asking, her hands trembling as she stirred sugar into her own. "No one cared back then," she said. "She was just a girl who didn't matter to them. I knew she didn't run away. She loved that bike." Kendra nodded. "Can I ask, did anyone suspicious ever take an interest in her?" Dolores looked at her, pain rising in her eyes. "There was one man, lived alone out near the woods, used to work at the mill. Everyone called him Coach, though I don't think he coached anything official. Just liked to hang around the high school." Kendra's breath caught. "Do you remember his name?" She nodded slowly. "Benny Corrick." The name wasn't unfamiliar. Kendra had seen it buried deep in older arrest records: disorderly conduct, trespassing, minor assault. Nothing that ever led to jail time, just enough to mark a man as trouble. That evening, she looked up the address listed on Corrick's last file: a cabin west of Birch Hollow, a few miles beyond where the bodies had been found. Remote, hidden, perfect. Kramer insisted they go together. They pulled into the overgrown drive the next morning, a thin trail of gravel leading to a collapsed porch and broken window panes. The cabin looked abandoned. Half the roof had caved in. But as they approached, Kendra saw something strange. A wind chime, freshly hung, clinked in the breeze. New ropes, not weathered. Someone had been here. They moved slowly, guns drawn, but the cabin was empty. Inside was dust, peeling wallpaper, and a single folding chair facing the fireplace. Above the mantel was a photograph of girls, 5 of them standing in front of a school bus. One wore a shirt with the name Marla written in glitter across the front. Kramer turned it over. No date, no other names, but in the half below, something glinted. Kendra reached in and pulled it out. A charm bracelet, still intact. One of the tiny charms was a silver volleyball. Jesus Christ, Kramer whispered. Forensics swarmed the cabin later that day. In a crawl space beneath the floorboards, they found a duffel bag containing Polaroids, dozens of them, each labeled with a name, a date, and a number. Melissa, January 3rd, 06, 4 Jade, September 17th, 04, 5 Marla, October 21st, 03. There were at least 10 names, all girls, all missing. The town of Pinebrook would never be the same after that. The headlines spread across the state. Local serial killer suspected in cold cases. But what chilled Kendra the most wasn't the photos. It was what was missing. No sign of Benny Corrick. No body. No clues. He had vanished. It had been 6 days since the discovery at the Corrick cabin, and the town of Pinebrook was breathing fire. Every news outlet from Nashville to Knoxville sent reporters. Satellite vans lined Main Street. Journalists camped outside the sheriff's office. Headlines filled with words like monster, horrific, and hidden for decades, each one digging the knife deeper into the town's image. Detective Kendra Doyle hated the attention. The story wasn't about panic, it was about justice, and it was nowhere near finished. Benny Corrick had vanished sometime around 2009, which aligned disturbingly well with the most recent name found among the Polaroids, a girl named Trisha Lawson, marked with a date, August 18, 2009. Pinebrook had no record of a Trisha Lawson ever living there, so Kendra started pulling reports from neighboring counties. By nightfall she found it, a 14-year-old girl from Green Hollow, 45 minutes away, missing after leaving a late band practice. No leads, no witnesses, no evidence. Her case had gone cold in less than a year, but she fit the pattern exactly. Same age range, same time frame, same vanishing act. Kendra now had 10 confirmed victims, maybe more. 6 sets of remains had been pulled from Birch Hollow, and Dr. Marcy Hill told them to brace themselves. At least 3 more grave sites had been located using ground-penetrating radar. Whoever Benny Corrick was, he'd been busy and deliberate. But what haunted Kendra most wasn't the crimes, it was the absence. Corrick had simply disappeared. No death certificate, no vehicle registration after 2010, no credit activity, not even a traffic ticket. A man doesn't just vanish, or does he? Back at the sheriff's office, Kendra pinned every photo of Corrick they had. Mugshots, driver's licenses, a grainy DMV photo from 2008, to the whiteboard. Next to them were the names of the victims and the timeline she'd painstakingly reconstructed. Her eyes kept returning to that final photo. Corrick, age 52, standing in front of his cabin. The edges were worn, but the expression chilled her, not because he was smiling, but because he looked ordinary. The kind of man who could be your neighbor, your teacher, your uncle. I want to re-interview anyone who lived near Birch Hollow in the early 2000s, she told Officer Kramer the next morning. Anyone who saw him, anyone who noticed anything off. Kramer sighed, leaning back in his chair. We've been through most of him already, Kendra. It's a ghost town up that way. Retirees and a few weekend hunters. Somebody knows something, she insisted. You don't bury 10 bodies within a few miles of your home without someone noticing. By noon she was back on the road, headed toward an old hunting shack just north of the hollow. An elderly man named Stanley Greaves had called in after seeing Corrick's face on the news. Said he remembered hearing things late at night, digging sounds, sometimes screaming. The place was tucked behind a wall of pines, surrounded by barbed wire and warning signs about trespassers. Greaves was waiting on the porch when she arrived, wrapped in a red flannel blanket. A shotgun leaned against the railing. "You're the detective," he said, not unkindly. "Yes, sir. You said you remembered something." He nodded, motioning her to sit. "Back in 04, I was hunting just before dawn, maybe 4:30 in the morning. Heard something out near the creek bed. At first I thought it was a coyote, but then I heard crying, real soft, like a girl." Kendra kept her voice steady. "Did you follow the sound?" Didn't dare, he said, eyes narrowing. That part of the woods gives me the chills even now. But next morning, I went back, found footprints, small ones, and drag marks in the dirt, like someone'd been pulled. He paused, and the silence thickened. I reported it, called it into Lemley, the sheriff back then. He told me not to worry, said the rain would have washed everything by now. Kendra's chest tightened. She jotted notes quickly, anger rising. George Lemley again, the same man who dismissed Marla Jessup's case, the same man who never even filed a missing persons report for 2 other girls in 2002. She thanked Greaves and headed straight for the county archives. In a locked filing cabinet, at the back of the building, she found the sheriff's logs from 2000, 2005. Half were barely legible, smudged with age and coffee rings, but she found the entry, report from Stanley Greaves, unconfirmed sounds in forest. No action taken, no follow-up, no record of an investigation, but something else caught her eye. Just beneath it, received package from concerned citizen. No return address. She flipped through the folder. No sign of any package. No photos. No reference to what it might have contained.
But something clicked in her mind.
Concerned citizen. That phrase had shown up in a few of the original missing persons reports. The anonymous caller, who phoned in a tip about Jade Miller's last known location. The note left under the windshield wiper of a deputy's car after the disappearance of Lacey Monroe in 2005. Same handwriting, same words, same misspelling of surveillance every time. Not a citizen at all. Corrick. She raced back to the office and started cross-referencing every anonymous tip filed between 2002 and 2009. There were 12, all typed, all unsigned. Each referenced a different girl. Each one had subtle clues, a location, a time, a detail only someone involved would know. Kendra leaned back in her chair. He wasn't just abducting them. He was watching the investigation, inserting himself, feeding breadcrumbs, playing with the people meant to stop him. That night, she couldn't sleep. She paced her apartment, rereading the notes. One sentence from the 2006 tip stuck in her mind. You're looking in the wrong place. The answers are deeper than you think. Deeper. The next morning, she called Dr. Hill. Marcy, when your team used GPR in the hollow, how deep did you scan? Standard protocol. 6 feet, she answered. Why? Go back. Scan 12. It took some convincing, but by noon the team was back in the clearing. The machines hummed quietly, sweeping the ground in slow arcs. At precisely 3:17 p.m., one of the techs raised his hand. Got something. Deep pocket. Looks like a container of some kind. They dug for hours, carefully, inch by inch. The soil gave way to rocks, then clay, then metal. A rusted oil drum, sealed tight, buried nearly 10 feet down. It took another hour to open it. Inside were 3 items: a worn composition notebook, a VHS tape, and a bundle wrapped in plastic. The notebook was labeled Confessions, the tape, Play Me First. The plastic bundle, blonde, dried, tied with a blue ribbon. Kendra didn't breathe for several seconds. They rushed everything back to the lab. The VHS was old, but still functional. They transferred the footage to digital, and played it on a secure monitor. The screen crackled. Then came a face. Not Corrick, a different man, early 60s, balding, cold eyes. He sat in front of the fireplace Kendra had seen in the cabin. My name is Leonard Rusk, the man said, and if you're watching this, I'm already gone. What followed was nearly 2 hours of confession. Rusk described in detail how he and Benny Corrick had met in 1996, while working at the same mill. How Corrick had brought him into something darker. How they shared a thirst for purity, for silence, for stillness. Rusk admitted to assisting in at least 5 abductions. He listed names, dates, places, but what struck Kendra the most was his final sentence. We never buried all of them in the hollow. Some were taken elsewhere. A second location. Only Benny knew where. The tape ended. Kendra felt the ground shift beneath her. There was more. More girls. More graves. More horror. And Benny Corrick, if he was still alive, was out there carrying the rest of the story with him. The tape changed everything. It wasn't just the contents chilling as they were. but the revelation that Benny Corrick hadn't acted alone. For over a decade, the working assumption had been that Pinebrook's hidden predator was a solitary man, quietly abducting young girls and burying them where no one would look. But now, with the confession of Leonard Rusk laid bare on screen, that assumption had crumbled. There had been 2 of them, and only one had left behind a confession. Detective Kendra Doyle spent the following 2 days combing through everything they had on Leonard Rusk: public records, arrest reports, workplace histories. She built the same timeline she'd built for Corrick. Rusk had died in 2017, according to a hospital record from Greene County. Cause of death: heart failure. He was cremated. No autopsy requested. His body, and the rest of his secrets, had turned to ash. But Benny Corrick, he was still missing. Still a ghost. Dr. Marcy Hill confirmed that the bundle of blonde hair wrapped in plastic contained DNA, not yet matched to any known victim. The name Michelle Ward was scribbled onto a slip of paper tucked inside the ribbon. Kendra ran the name. Another missing girl disappeared in 2007, this time from Dunlap, an hour away from Pinebrook. The pattern held. With the confirmation of Rusk's involvement, Kendra expanded the radius of her search. The confession made it clear there was another burial site. Corrick had spread the horror wider than anyone had imagined. But where? The answer came from the most unlikely place. A retired trucker named Eli Thornfield had called the tip line after seeing a newspaper story about the Birch Hollow remains. He told the operator something strange. "I knew Benny Corrick," he'd said. "Least I think I did. Went by Ben. Lived in a trailer outside of Red Fern for a while. Worked odd jobs. Kept to himself. Real quiet. But I remember he always asked me about hunting spots. Liked the places that were off the map. You know, said he wanted somewhere untouched." That was the word he used. Untouched. Red Fern was 2 counties over. An hour and a half by road. Practically the middle of nowhere. Kendra and Officer Kramer took the drive the next morning. The directions led them down gravel roads, past hay bales and rotting barns, until they reached a forgotten clearing, surrounded by deer stands and abandoned tree blinds. There was nothing remarkable about it, and that was what made it perfect. They searched for hours. No signs of habitation. But then, just beyond the edge of the tree line, Kramer spotted a pile of discolored earth, a faint rectangle in the grass, fresh enough to notice, old enough to be covered by leaves. Kendra called in Marcy Hill's team. It took 2 days to excavate the area properly. They found 3 more oil drums, identical to the one buried in Birch Hollow. Inside each were bones, clothing fragments, and what appeared to be trophies. A girl's diary, a stuffed rabbit, water damaged but intact, a friendship bracelet. Kendra stared at the items with a kind of stunned silence. Each one represented a child whose story had been cut short. Each one was an accusation. Each one pointed to a monster who'd never been brought to justice. But the discovery also raised more questions. Why bury them here? Why split the victims between 2 places? And why did Corrick stop? The last confirmed disappearance had been in 2009. Since then, nothing. It made no sense. People like Corrick didn't just stop, unless they were forced to. Back at the station, Kendra dug deeper. She requested Corrick's employment records. Between 2005 and 2009, he'd worked part-time as a delivery driver. Prior to that, he'd done janitorial work at a local community college. Then in August 2009, the same month Tricia Lawson vanished. He quit. No forwarding address, no subsequent employment. The trail ended cold, until a records clerk from the Social Security Administration called her back. "We ran your subject's number through the system," the clerk said. "There's been no earnings activity since 2009. But there was a death benefit request submitted in 2011. Kendra sat up. Someone reported him dead. Correct. A woman named Deborah Millstone said she was his cousin. Provided a copy of a death certificate issued in Texas. Kendra froze. Texas. She pulled the file. The certificate was amateurish, pixelated, missing signatures, no coroner's stamp. It was a forgery. She tracked the address listed on the form, a P.O. box outside of El Paso. When she called the number linked to the P.O. box, it was disconnected. Someone had tried to bury Corrick on paper, which meant he was alive somewhere. Kendra requested security footage, vehicle registrations, anything that might link Corrick to travel beyond Tennessee. Weeks passed, leads dried up, but then came the break. A DNA sample submitted to a genealogy site by a man in Arizona triggered a partial match in the federal system. The match connected him to one of the unidentified victims from Birch Hollow, someone they hadn't yet named. The man was her brother. He'd last seen his sister Marlene in 2003. She had run away from their home in Arkansas, possibly hitchhiking toward Nashville. She'd never arrived, but now they knew where she'd ended up. And more importantly, they now knew that Corrick, or Rusk, had operated far beyond Pine Brook. The scope of the crime expanded again. 9 counties, at least 15 victims, 2 confirmed perpetrators, and the main suspect, still at large. Kendra returned to the oil drum journal. The one labeled Confessions. It was rambling, erratic. Most entries were half-finished thoughts, written in blocky, aggressive letters. Corrick described some of the abductions in vague, euphemistic terms. She was clean. She didn't scream. And this one reminded me of Claire. I made her stop talking. Claire. The name showed up 5 times. Kendra flipped back to the earlier pages. Each time Corrick mentioned Claire, it was in moments of regret or confusion. I told Claire I would stop. She forgave me once. I buried her deepest. Claire wasn't a target. Claire was someone he knew. Maybe someone he cared for. She started cross-referencing every Claire listed in Pine Brook during Corrick's years of activity. And that's when she found her.
Claire Corrick, sister, born in 1953, died in 1997. Car accident. Single vehicle. Ruled a fatal collision with a deer. No investigation. But the details didn't sit right with Kendra. Claire's car had been found off a rural service road near Birch Hollow. No brake marks. No sign of impact. The coroner's report cited blunt force trauma and neck fracture, but listed no photos, no scans. Kendra called Dr. Marcy Hill. Is there any chance Claire Corrick could be buried in that hollow? Marcy paused. We found a set of remains we couldn't match. Adult female, around 45. Cause of death was a broken neck and a fractured skull. Was she in an oil drum? No. Buried alone, deeper than the others. Kendra's stomach turned. She was buried deepest, she repeated, the words from the journal haunting her. Claire Corrick hadn't died in a car accident. She had been killed, and that might have been the turning point. Claire may have known. Maybe she confronted him. Maybe she threatened to go to police. And Benny Corrick silenced her. But guilt, twisted as it may have been, may have driven him into hiding. Or maybe he just ran out of people he could bear to kill. It was hard to say which was worse. They reburied the victims with ceremony. Each was given a proper headstone, their names etched in granite where they could never again be erased. The case remained open. A manhunt for Benny Corrick was issued nationwide, but he was never found. Some believed he had taken his own life in the mountains somewhere, buried in the forest that once hid his crimes. Others claimed to see him now and then, in Colorado, in New Mexico, in diners on empty highways. Always older, always alone. Kendra stayed with the department another 2 years before stepping away from law enforcement. But she carried the Birch Hollow case with her. Every face, every name, every unanswered question. She once visited the site again, just before sunset. The clearing was quiet now. Grass had started to grow back. Trees bent gently in the wind. But beneath the surface, the ground still remembered. And so did she. The shallow grave at Birch Hollow was no longer shallow. It was a wound that would never quite close. The quiet man of Pine Hollow. Pine Hollow was not on most maps. It was a place people passed through without realizing it. A 2-lane stretch tucked into the folds of rural Virginia, where trees bent low over the road and houses stood at respectful distances. At dusk, fog would settle into the hollows, giving everything a muted, silvered stillness. There were only a few hundred residents, and fewer still who lived out by the timberline, where the cell service vanished and the roads turned to gravel. That's where Albert Grayson lived. For 23 years, Albert's weather-beaten farmhouse sat on a hill that overlooked the sleepy valley. He wasn't from Pine Hollow, but no one could remember when exactly he'd arrived. Some said it was back in the early 90s. Others recalled seeing him at the farmer's market a few times in the late aughts, standing beside jars of homemade jam and quietly offering free samples. He didn't talk much, but when he did, his voice was soft and patient. He looked older than he likely was, grey beard, eyes slightly sunken, clothes that hung loose like they were borrowed. Most folks just called him the quiet man. For years, Albert lived without much notice. His property was surrounded by thick woods, and his nearest neighbor was half a mile away. He kept to himself. People would see him occasionally at the post office, or buying chicken feed, or sitting quietly on the bench outside the gas station with a book in hand. He was always polite. Never odd, exactly. Just solitary. That's why the missing girl didn't make sense at first. Her name was Riley Cobb. 16 years old, disappeared on a humid July afternoon in 2011. She had been walking home from her summer job at the diner in neighboring Middletown. It was just under 4 miles, a route she had taken a dozen times without incident. She didn't own a phone, so it wasn't until dinner time that her mother realized she hadn't come home. When local deputies retraced her route, they found a single flip-flop on the shoulder of Route 34. No blood, no signs of struggle, just that. As if she'd vanished into the heat. The town felt it deeply. Riley had lived in Pine Hollow her whole life. Her mother worked part-time at the grocery store. Her father laid bricks for a local contractor. Riley was known for her warmth. She tutored younger kids in math, volunteered at church picnics, and once organized a fundraiser for a neighbor with cancer. Her absence felt like a thread pulled loose from the fabric of the town. The sheriff's office did what it could. They brought in tracking dogs, searched the woods, dredged nearby creeks, questioned every driver known to frequent Route 34, from logging trucks to retired teachers, but nothing turned up. No one had seen her after 3:10 p.m. When she left the diner, she had simply disappeared. The case grew colder with each passing season. By winter, her photo was fading on the bulletin board at the general store. Her mother still drove the route sometimes, slowing at the spot where the flip-flop had been found, scanning the ditches. There were rumors, as there always are. Some said she'd run away with an older man. Others whispered darker things about men in trucks, or bodies buried beneath hunting blinds. But no one suspected Albert Grayson. Not yet. It would take 5 more years for that to happen. In 2016, a boy named Caleb Fletcher went missing. He was 12. A curious, wiry child with a love of insects and a tendency to wander. He was last seen near the Pine Hollow Bridge, crouching beside a creek bed with a mason jar. His parents reported him missing just before nightfall. Once again, the town mobilized. Flashlights lit up the woods, search parties fanned out across fields and culverts, but there was no trace of Caleb, no torn fabric, no disturbed ground, just the empty jar, still upright by the water. The similarities to Riley's case were unnerving. Different gender, different age, but the same eerie silence, the same void. 2 missing children in 5 years was rare for a town this small, too rare. People began to talk. There was no hard evidence, nothing to draw a line between the disappearances and any suspect. But fear doesn't need proof. It just needs possibility. Parents stopped letting their children walk alone. The church began holding weekly prayer vigils. Locks were installed on doors that had never needed them before. Still, Albert Grayson remained outside suspicion. He had no known connection to either victim, no criminal record. He had offered to help in the second search, quietly as always, but sincerely. He brought coffee and blankets to volunteers. He was even seen consoling one of Caleb's relatives, his hand resting gently on their shoulder. People noted how sad he looked, how tired. But someone was starting to ask questions. Her name was Dana Ellis, a former Pine Hollow resident who had returned to care for her aging mother. She had gone to school with Riley's older sister and remembered the girl's disappearance vividly. Now with Caleb missing, the memories stirred something in her. Dana was not a police officer, she wasn't trained in criminology, but she had instincts and time. She began reviewing old newspaper clippings, visiting the library, mapping out the locations where both children were last seen. What she found was subtle, but strange. Both Riley and Caleb had vanished within a mile of a narrow forest road that led to Albert Grayson's property. It meant little, on its own, a coincidence perhaps. But Dana remembered something from her teenage years. A different girl, named Holly Merrick, who disappeared while hiking during a camping trip back in 1998. Holly had been 17. Her body was never found. The incident had always been considered a tragic accident, perhaps a fall into a ravine, or a misstep near the old quarry. But when Dana checked, she found that Holly's campsite had been located less than 2 miles from the same logging trail. Her unease deepened. 3 disappearances, nearly 2 decades apart, all within walking distance of one man's home. She brought her findings to the sheriff. They were courteous but non-committal. "We'll look into it," she was told. Nothing concrete yet. But Dana didn't stop. She posted on forums, contacted families, found a local journalist with an interest in cold cases. The wheels began turning. Then came the fire. On an unusually warm March morning in 2017, smoke was spotted rising from the woods outside Pine Hollow. The source was traced to a small shed behind Albert Grayson's home. By the time firefighters arrived, most of the structure had collapsed into ash. It was believed to be accidental, perhaps an electrical short, or a heating lamp knocked over by an animal. But something inside had survived the flames. Buried beneath the scorched timber, investigators found a metal drum. It was partially melted, twisted by heat, but inside, shielded by the insulation of the soil and debris, were bones, tiny ones, human remains. The search intensified. A warrant was issued, cadaver dogs were brought in. Over the course of a week 3 shallow graves were uncovered on Albert's property, spaced out carefully along the tree line. In each bone fragments, cloth and strands of hair. Dental records identified one set as Riley Cobb, another as Caleb Fletcher. The third set remained unknown. Albert Grayson was arrested without incident. Neighbors said he looked exhausted. He didn't resist, didn't speak, just held out his hands and allowed the cuffs to be placed. As he was led to the cruiser, he turned once briefly to look at the valley below. Then he ducked his head and disappeared behind the door. No one could understand it. Not the volunteers he'd stood beside. Not the postmaster he chatted with every December. Not the children he'd watched grow up from a distance. A man who had lived among them for decades, quietly, patiently, who had offered free jam, and nodded politely at stop signs, who had buried 3 children in his backyard. The shock didn't settle, it spread, and the questions were only beginning. The investigation that followed the arrest of Albert Grayson unfolded slowly, like a storm rolling in from a distant ridge, not with sirens or panic, but with a heavy quietness, a sort of reverence for the betrayal that had just been uncovered. People in Pine Hollow weren't just processing the deaths of children, they were trying to grasp how someone could live among them, smile at their babies, hold open doors, and carry such secrets. Grayson's farmhouse, once barely noticed beyond the pine trees, became the epicenter of controlled chaos. Crime scene tape fluttered at the edge of his gravel drive, where no car had ever idled longer than a delivery truck. Investigators in white suits moved carefully through the house and surrounding woods, marking disturbed soil, photographing unearthed buttons and fibers, cataloging every splintered piece of timber from the burned shed. The man himself, now 61, sat in a small holding cell in Middletown County Jail. His beard had been trimmed for booking photos, revealing a sharp jawline and skin the color of parchment. He was under suicide watch, though he'd shown no indication of harming himself. He remained quiet, even during questioning, responding only in the barest terms when asked procedural details. Name, address, date of birth. Beyond that, he offered nothing. Not a word about the children.
Not a word about the fire. Not a single denial or explanation. Detective Sean Halperin, lead investigator from the county's Special Crimes Unit, described the interrogation as an encounter with silence. He wasn't combative or evasive, he said. He was simply still, as though all the movement had gone out of him. The community, meanwhile, was caught in a pendulum between grief and disbelief. People remembered encounters in vivid flashes. One woman recalled how Albert once returned her lost dog, cradled gently in his arms. A former school teacher remembered Albert donating to a fund for art supplies, despite having no known family or ties to the school. These small kindnesses now took on a darker, nauseating undertone, as if kindness itself had been part of the disguise. Local media latched onto the story quickly. Headlines spoke of a small-town monster, a lone predator, even a rural Hannibal. But to those who had lived beside him, those labels felt too loud, too clean. There had been no signs, no trail of cruelty, just an ever-present man who had watched from the quiet edges of town. As forensic teams continued their work, attention turned to the third set of remains found on the property. It took 2 weeks of testing, DNA matching, and the exhumation of medical records, but the results eventually came back. The bones belonged to Holly Merrick, the 17-year-old who had gone missing in 1998 during a camping trip. The realization settled heavily on the town. Holly's case had long been considered an unfortunate accident, a tragic misstep in the unpredictable wilderness. But it hadn't been an accident. She had never wandered off. She had been taken, likely watched, stalked, lured, and now, nearly 2 decades later, the truth had returned to them in bone and ash. For her parents, the news brought a bittersweet ache. Her father, Gregory Merrick, had passed away in 2007. Her mother, Nadine, now in her late 70s, was brought by wheelchair to a private briefing at the sheriff's office. She sat quietly while the evidence was presented. She did not cry. She simply placed a thin hand on the photograph of the bones and whispered, "She always hated the cold." As investigators began compiling a timeline of Grayson's possible movements and victims, the challenge became clear. They knew so little about him. His paper trail was sparse. He had no known relatives. He paid his taxes, yes, but had no online presence, no credit card debt, no clear history of previous employment. Some residents recalled that he might have worked odd jobs years ago, some carpentry here, animal care there, but nothing formal. The deeper they looked, the stranger it became. There was no driver's license issued in Virginia prior to 1992. That was the first official record placing him in the state, registering the farmhouse under a limited liability company, paying cash. Before that, his past was blank. Detectives reached out to the FBI. The Bureau began combing through missing persons databases, old records from other counties, even attempts at facial recognition, but nothing definitive surfaced. It was as if the man had stepped into existence one day with a name and a deed, and never looked back. For weeks, locals gathered at the church basement every Sunday night for candlelight vigils. They sang softly, read scriptures aloud. Some just sat and stared at the floor. The hurt was deepened by the sense of betrayal. Not only were children taken, but trust itself had been broken. The illusion that they knew their neighbors, that Pine Hollow was safe, had dissolved. Dana Ellis, the woman whose quiet efforts had sparked the investigation, was invited to speak at one of the gatherings. She didn't want recognition, but she understood the town needed someone to put words to what had happened. She stood at the front of the room and said simply, "I think we wanted to believe we were too small to matter to someone dangerous. But maybe that's why he chose here. Because we thought this kind of thing didn't happen in places like this." And in the hush that followed, more than one head nodded. Meanwhile, Grayson's defense attorney, appointed by the state, prepared for the upcoming arraignment. There was little strategy to offer. The physical evidence was overwhelming. The human remains alone ensured that the case would go to trial. The fire, while not fatal to any victim, suggested an attempt to destroy evidence. And if prosecutors could prove premeditation, The death penalty could be on the table. Still, the defense hoped for some kind of understanding. A motive, a confession, something that could make sense of what this man had done. But Albert Grayson never spoke. Not about guilt, not about sorrow, not even about the names of those he had taken. He remained in his cell, day after day, eating quietly, reading when books were offered. A nurse said he once smiled when she brought him a volume of Thoreau's Walden. Another guard said he had a fondness for honey in his tea. But these small glimpses did little to humanize him in the public eye. When a psychiatric evaluation was ordered, the results were equally inconclusive. Grayson was not deemed insane, nor was he intellectually impaired. He was quiet, yes, but lucid, logical, unemotional perhaps, but coherent. One doctor noted that he exhibited a remarkably flat affect, but no overt signs of psychosis or delusion. In other words, he was sane. And that for many was the most unsettling truth of all. A sane man had done this. As spring turned to summer, the farmhouse on the hill remained abandoned, now cordoned off for evidence review. Grass grew long around the porch steps. Wind rattled the loose shutter on the side. From a distance it looked no different than it ever had. Just a house. Just a dot in the valley. But people no longer drove past it at dusk. No one paused at the gate. Even the birds seemed to avoid the trees near the shed's charred remains. The air around the place had changed, less from what had been done there, and more from what it revealed about how evil could hide in plain sight. Back in town, there was talk of building a memorial garden. Something gentle, trees planted in the names of Riley, Caleb and Holly. A plaque that didn't tell the whole story, but enough to mark their absence. The pastor suggested wildflowers. Let it be beautiful, he said. Let it be something the children would have liked. And they did build it. By the end of August, 3 saplings stood behind the community center, each marked with a small wooden sign, each surrounded by freshly turned earth and pale blue forget-me-nots. On warm evenings you could sometimes find people sitting there, quietly, just looking, not talking, just remembering. As for Albert Grayson, he remained behind bars, awaiting trial. But everyone understood something deeply, though few said it aloud. The trial would not change much. The dead were still gone, the years had still passed, and the man at the center of it all had already told them everything he ever would by saying nothing. There were still rumors, of course. Whispers of more graves, more victims, more secrets in the woods that no shovel would ever find. Some claimed he'd kept journals, though none were recovered. Others speculated he had once lived under a different name, in another small town, perhaps with a trail of silence behind him. But none of it could be proven. And so the mystery of the quiet man endured. He had watched. He had waited. And then he had vanished from their world, not in body, but in spirit, swallowed by the concrete walls of a place where names are just numbers, and no one waves across the fence line. Still, sometimes when the fog rolled into Pine Hollow, and the dusk light turned amber through the trees, someone might glance at that distant house on the hill, and feel the weight of what they missed. The courtroom in Middletown County was small. There were only 5 rows of benches on each side, and the ceiling creaked faintly whenever the wind pushed against the tall, narrow windows. On the morning of Albert Grayson's arraignment, every seat was filled. The air carried the stillness of expectation. No one spoke louder than a whisper. Even the journalists kept their camera shutters low and respectful, as though some part of them, too, was aware that they were not simply covering a crime. They were bearing witness to something quietly unthinkable. Grayson entered without shackles, flanked by 2 officers. His expression was blank, but not dazed. He looked at no one in particular, his eyes hovering near the floor. A courtroom sketch artist later noted that he seemed unnervingly relaxed, as if standing in front of a judge to answer for the deaths of 3 children was no more significant than waiting for a cup of coffee to cool. The charges were read aloud. 3 counts of first-degree murder, abuse of a corpse and arson. When asked to enter a plea, he paused only a moment before saying, softly, "Not guilty." A whisper moved through the room. Not outrage, not disbelief, but a subdued ripple of sadness. It meant there would be a trial. It meant that the families would have to hear the evidence. It meant the worst parts would be spoken aloud. But they stayed. All of them. Riley Cobb's mother, seated in the front row, held a folded tissue in both hands and never looked away from the defendant. Caleb Fletcher's father sat behind her, his jaw rigid, eyes flicking between the judge and the man who had buried his son. Nadine Merrick, Holly's mother, sat quietly in her wheelchair, her hands resting in her lap like folded cloth. They were not there for vengeance. Not really. They were there for the parts of their children that still lived in memory. The sound of a laugh, the curl of a hair, the note left on a refrigerator. The trial was not just a legal formality to them. It was a ritual of naming, saying out loud what had been taken, and who had taken it. The prosecution, led by Commonwealth Attorney Lucinda Parr, was methodical and composed. She knew she did not need to dramatize. The evidence would speak for itself. The forensic reports, the dental records, the location of the remains, the melted drum, the partially burned blanket that matched one missing from the Cobb household, the GPS mapping of Grayson's land, the soil samples, the time-stamped security camera footage showing Riley walking past a gas station, never to be seen again. Each piece came slowly, like drops of water filling a glass, measured, inevitable. The defense had little room to maneuver. Public defender Michael Bergen was an experienced attorney with a steady demeanor. He had handled difficult cases before. Arson, abuse, even manslaughter. But this was different. This wasn't a case built on circumstantial ambiguity. It was a wall of evidence without a door. Still, he did his duty. He raised questions about chain of custody for certain pieces of evidence. He suggested that the fire might have been accidental, caused by faulty wiring in an aging structure. He argued that while Grayson's property had been the burial site, there was no direct evidence placing him at the moment of the deaths. No DNA, no fingerprints, no confessions, but these were procedural defenses. Thin arguments stretched over a canyon. The deeper question, the one no one could answer, was motive. Why? Why Riley? Why Caleb? Why Holly? What thread connected them? Was it opportunity? Was it ritual? Was it a compulsion? Or something quieter, harder to define? The court-appointed psychologist, Dr. Andrea Mills, took the stand during the third week of the trial. Her testimony was soft-spoken, clinical but not cold. She had spent over 12 hours across 4 sessions interviewing Grayson. I found him coherent, she said. Intellectually capable, emotionally subdued. Did he express remorse? The prosecutor asked. Dr. Mills paused, then shook her head. He did not express remorse, nor pride, nor denial. He exhibited what we refer to as a dissociative detachment, a psychological distancing from his own actions, not due to illness, but possibly as a mechanism developed over years of isolation. Did he acknowledge the deaths? He acknowledged the remains were on his property. He did not offer explanation. Later, under cross-examination, the defense asked, "Would you say he is a danger to others?" Dr. Mills nodded once. Yes, he is dangerous precisely because he does not perceive others as emotionally real. He does not harm in anger. He harms in silence. The phrase lingered in the air. He harms in silence. In the gallery, a woman quietly wept. Outside the courtroom, Pine Hollow struggled with its own kind of trial, a psychological reckoning. The discovery of the murders had hollowed something out of the town, not just grief, but a confidence in the world's logic. Evil, they thought, wore a mask. It shouted. It drew attention. But Grayson had not shouted. He had nodded kindly at neighbors. He had bought apples from roadside stands. He had paid his taxes, shoveled his walkway, and read poetry. Now, every interaction from the past 20 years was being re-evaluated under a new light. A woman recalled how her son once ran across Grayson's property chasing a dog. He just waved from the porch. She said, "That's all. Just waved." Another man remembered Grayson helping to lift a fallen tree after a storm. He didn't say much, just pointed at a branch and started sawing. There were no warning signs, no red flags, just a long, slow presence. A man who had been there for decades, who had blended so completely into the quiet that no one had ever truly looked at him. By the 5th week of the trial, the tone in the courtroom began to shift. The grief remained, but the atmosphere thickened with something else: resignation, a sense that no explanation would come, no motive would be given, the children would not be named in confession, the puzzle would remain incomplete. Then unexpectedly, something changed. The final week, during a routine administrative session, the prosecutor submitted an exhibit found in Grayson's attic, a small leather-bound notebook. Not a journal, exactly, but a kind of ledger. Inside, in tiny handwriting, were 4 names: Riley Caleb Holly, and one more, Mallory J. The prosecution hadn't included this in their original presentation, because the forensic team had only recently authenticated the notebook's age and origin. It had been tucked beneath insulation, almost missed. There was no date next to Mallory's name, no details, just initials. The room held its breath. Authorities quickly reopened cold case files. Within days they discovered that a girl named Mallory Jenkins had disappeared from a rest stop in West Virginia in 1986. She had been 14, traveling with her aunt to North Carolina. At the time, it was assumed she had been abducted by a passing trucker. Her case had gone unsolved. The family had moved out of state. The memory had faded from public record. The discovery of her name in Grayson's home changed that. It suggested a pattern that extended further back than anyone had imagined. If Grayson had been active in the 1980s, he would have been in his early 20s. And if Mallory's name was there, how many others were missing? The FBI returned with cadaver dogs. Satellite scans were used to examine the forested acreage around the farmhouse. Ground-penetrating radar was deployed in select locations. They found 2 more burial sites, both too deteriorated for immediate identification, both hidden with the same care, shallow but precise, spaced apart, as if placed with thought, even reverence. No signs of haste. By the time the jury returned its verdict, the emotional weight in the courtroom was nearly unbearable. Guilty on all counts. Albert Grayson showed no reaction. He stood, listened, nodded slightly, and was led away. In the weeks that followed, he was transferred to a maximum security facility pending sentencing. He did not appeal. He did not speak to press. He refused all interview requests. He simply vanished into the folds of the prison system, leaving behind only names and questions. The town, in time, began to breathe again, but differently. They planted more trees in the memorial garden, 1 for Mallory, 2 for the unnamed. They added a bench, a fountain with a small inscription: "Let no child be forgotten. Let every silence be heard." Children walked to school again, but in groups. Doors were locked. Porch lights were left on longer, and when people passed each other in the grocery store or at the gas station, they paused longer than before, made eye contact, asked how things were, not because they feared the next Albert Grayson, but because they had learned how easy it was to not see someone, and how costly that blindness could be. Albert Grayson's sentence was handed down on a grey afternoon in October. There was no drama, no media spectacle. The judge, a soft-spoken man from neighboring Clark County, read the verdict calmly. 3 life sentences without the possibility of parole. 2 additional life terms for the unidentified victims. 1 for arson, 1 for abuse of a corpse. No chance of early release. No possibility of ever walking outside the walls of Redstone Correctional Facility again. Grayson didn't speak. He stood with his hands folded loosely in front of him, the same way he had during his arraignment, during every court appearance since. When asked if he had anything to say, he shook his head gently. Just once. No apology, no defense, not even a whisper. He was led from the courtroom and disappeared from Pine Hollow's sight forever. but the echoes of what he left behind remained. That winter was colder than most. Snow came early, blanketing the hills and valleys around Pine Hollow in a quiet that felt somehow heavier than usual. The trees stood bare and still, like silent witnesses. On certain mornings, you could still see the faint impressions where crime scene tents had once stood outside the farmhouse on the hill. The house remained unsold. The property had been seized by the state, but no one expressed interest in buying it, not even developers. There were whispers of a demolition, but nothing was scheduled. It sat there through winter, unclaimed, untouched, almost forgotten except in thought. A thin sheet of ice formed on the birdbath out front. The porch roof began to sag. The grass grew brittle and yellow, and beneath the soil, the forest began reclaiming the trails worn down by boots and search teams, brushing over the memories with moss and rot and silence. Back in town, the trial's end did not bring the closure some had expected. There were no parades of relief, no cathartic press conferences. What had happened had lodged itself too deeply into the fabric of things. People tried, of course. Life did not stop. The post office continued to open at 8 sharp. Children returned to school. Teenagers, cautious at first, began gathering again at the edge of the lake. Weddings were planned. Groceries bought. The routines resumed. But under it all, something had shifted. As though the town had aged 10 years in just one. Even joy, when it came, seemed quieter. Some of that was by choice. A kind of reverence had settled in, the understanding that grief doesn't end with a verdict, that healing isn't the same as forgetting, that the weight of absence doesn't vanish, it just becomes something we learn to carry, and Pine Hollow carried it. At the center of this quiet transformation was the memorial garden. What had begun as a simple gesture, 3 trees and a plaque, grew into something larger, more sacred. Over the months more people came, not just families of the victims, but strangers, neighbors, teachers, people who hadn't even known Riley, Caleb or Holly personally, but who had felt the loss all the same.
They brought candles in jars, notes wrapped in plastic, drawings made by children who weren't yet born when the victims had disappeared. The trees, once just saplings, were growing taller, their shadows stretched farther now. On windy days, they whispered against each other, in a way that sounded almost like names. Dana Ellis visited often. She never said much during her visits. Sometimes she just sat on the bench for an hour, looking at the flowers. Other times she brought clippings from nearby towns, articles about other cold cases reopened after the Pine Hollow trial, tips inspired by the renewed attention. She remained involved with victim advocacy groups, but she kept her voice soft, her presence unobtrusive. She never sought the spotlight. She had never wanted it to begin with. "I just wanted someone to listen," she said once, during a quiet interview with a regional newspaper, and eventually someone did. She received letters, occasionally, from other amateur sleuths. Some asked for advice. Some wanted to share stories from their own towns. Many of them wondered the same thing. How many others are still out there? The question haunted Dana too. Not just the possibility of other crimes, but the unsettling truth that Grayson had functioned so well for so long. He had killed without pattern, without outburst, without leaving behind the breadcrumbs most killers do. If not for the fire, if not for a shed burning on an early spring morning, would he have ever been discovered? And what about the others like him? The ones who don't fit the mold, who don't brag or boast, who live quietly, blending in, harming in silence. The FBI's investigation remained open for another year. They cross-referenced old files, missing persons reports, Jane Does from surrounding counties. They found other names, but no concrete ties. Mallory Jenkins remained the only confirmed victim outside Virginia. The additional 2 remains found on Grayson's property were still unidentified, despite DNA being uploaded to national databases. The authorities hoped that someday someone would recognize a detail, a bone structure, a piece of clothing, but no one had come forward. Those 2 children were buried together, side by side, in a cemetery just outside of town. A simple stone marked their graves. Here rest 2 souls, known to God, May they never be forgotten. Riley, Caleb, Holly and Mallory were buried in family plots. On the anniversaries of their disappearances, candles would appear on their gravestones, sometimes handmade wreaths. In Riley's case, people often left math books, reminders of the tutoring she had once done. For Caleb it was mason jars, sometimes filled with marbles or bugs made of colored glass. Holly's grave received sunflowers. Mallory's received a postcard each year, sent anonymously from West Virginia, always bearing the same words, "I remember you." In Redstone Correctional Facility, Albert Grayson remained as he had always been, quiet. He was held in a single occupancy cell. No disciplinary issues, no recorded incidents. He spent most of his days reading. He rarely spoke to other inmates. Staff described him as unremarkable, polite and strangely courteous. He did not grant interviews. He did not write letters. When asked once by a prison chaplain if he wished to speak about what he had done, he reportedly replied, "There's nothing worth saying. The damage is already done." He remained an enigma. No journals were ever found. No manifestos, no scribbled poems, just a name, a home, a lifetime of hiding in plain sight. There were those who continued to speculate. Criminologists who called him a unique psychological profile. Podcasters who picked apart his behavior. Some claimed he was a pure sociopath. Others believed he was shaped by trauma, by isolation, perhaps by something more unknowable. But no consensus was ever reached, because Grayson refused to be known, and in that refusal, he preserved the mystery he had lived in. 3 years passed, then 4. By the 5th year after his arrest, Pine Hollow had settled into a quieter, steadier rhythm. New families moved in. A daycare opened on Main Street. The old mill was converted into a bakery. People began to speak more easily again. But they didn't forget. Each year, on the anniversary of the fire that led to everything unraveling, the town held a candlelight vigil in the memorial garden. No speeches, no microphones, just music, soft guitar, the rustle of trees, and the flicker of flames lined along the path. It was there one October evening that a woman stepped forward with a photo. It was a childhood photo, faded, curled at the edges, a girl in overalls, smiling. The woman placed it gently on the 4th tree, next to Holly's. "I think this is her," she said softly. Authorities followed up. DNA was submitted. A month later, it was confirmed one of the unidentified sets of remains had belonged to a girl named Samantha Klein, missing since 1992. She had run away from a foster home outside Charlottesville. No one had known where she'd gone. She had simply vanished. Now she had been found. Her name was carved into a new stone next to the memorial bench. The wildflowers were replanted around it. The wind through the trees seemed to shift direction for a while. As for the last set of remains, no one ever came forward, but the town kept the marker, not out of obligation, but because grief, when given space, becomes something more than pain. It becomes memory, presence, witness. In the end, the story of Albert Grayson didn't end with a gavel or a grave. It ended with trees, with names remembered, with children's drawings taped to fences, with a town that learned painfully and permanently that evil can wear a neighbor's face, but that goodness too can rise quietly in response. Grayson died of natural causes in 2024, alone in his prison cell. There was no funeral, no obituary, no next of kin. He left behind nothing but questions. But in Pine Hollow, what mattered was not how he died, but how the town chose to live afterward. By remembering the lost, by walking each other home, by looking up from time to time, really looking and knowing, without doubt, that silence can be dangerous, but so can love, when it's quiet and enduring. And sometimes, that's what saves us. Salt Lake City wakes slowly in the summer. The light comes early, but the heat lingers like a second skin. On July 19th, 2004, the air was already warm before dawn. By 6 a.m., the sidewalks shimmered faintly, and the noise of the waking city had begun its usual rhythm. Distant traffic, sprinklers ticking, and the soft hum of air conditioners straining against the growing heat. At the University of Utah Hospital, Lori Hacking arrived for her morning run. It was part of her routine. Laurie was training for a new chapter in life. She and her husband, Mark, were preparing to move to Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Mark had been accepted into medical school there, or so he had said. The two of them were young, deeply intertwined, and looking toward a future that seemed certain. Laurie ran alone that morning, or at least that was what people assumed. But by 10 a.m., no one had heard from her. She hadn't shown up to work at Wells Fargo, where she was a stockbroker's assistant. Her phone went unanswered. She wasn't home. A co-worker contacted Mark, who then called the police and reported his wife missing. According to Mark, Laurie had gone jogging early that morning and never returned. What followed was a search that grew with swift intensity. Within hours, volunteers combed the neighborhood. Police scoured the park near the hospital. Flyers were printed with her smiling photo, 27 years old, long brown hair, eyes framed by soft dimples, and a face that radiated kindness. She was known for her gentleness, her thoughtfulness, her tendency to write heartfelt notes to people she loved. The city rallied behind her, but behind the scenes, something else was unraveling. By July 20th, the second day of the search, a different kind of discovery had surfaced. Laurie's car, a white Corolla, had been found near the hospital where she usually jogged. It appeared undisturbed, keys on the seat, purse in the front, but no signs of struggle. Friends and family were still holding on to hope. But detectives were growing uneasy. They reviewed Mark's timeline again. He said he'd last seen Laurie at around 5:30 a.m. when she left for her run. He said he'd gone back to sleep. Later that morning, he went to a furniture store to buy a mattress. That detail stood out. Why a mattress? Why that morning? Police noted it and moved on. Then a friend came forward with something else. Just days before Laurie disappeared, she had learned something devastating. Mark had been lying to her. He had not been accepted into medical school. In fact, he had never even graduated from college. The entire plan, the move to North Carolina, the school, the future they had been building, was based on a lie. Laurie had found out on Friday, July 16th. She had been devastated, but she hadn't told many people, just a few close friends. Her parents didn't know. She hadn't left him, at least not yet. But she was shaken. It was the kind of breach that reshapes the entire foundation of trust. And then 3 days later, she vanished. Police returned to Mark. The inconsistencies began to multiply. He had told officers he'd been out shopping for furniture after Laurie left for her run. But surveillance footage showed him buying a mattress and box spring at a store around 10:30 a.m. after he had reported her missing. Even stranger, the store's employees noticed that he was barefoot. Not casually barefoot, like someone who forgot sandals, just barefoot. No shoes, no socks. He didn't explain it. He seemed slightly agitated, they said. Rushed, focused on making the purchase, he asked them to discard the old mattress. Police took note of that too. They retrieved the discarded mattress from the store's dumpster. It was stained. A warrant was issued for the hacking apartment. Officers combed the small unit, looking for anything, any sign of a struggle, any proof of Laurie's presence or absence that morning. What they found was disturbing. Blood traces throughout the bedroom, on the bed frame, on the walls, on the floor. DNA confirmed it belonged to Laurie. Suddenly, the theory of a stranger abduction during a morning jog dissolved. The evidence didn't point to a woman who vanished on the street. It pointed to a woman who never made it out of her own apartment. Investigators circled back to Mark. They noted that in the days after Laurie's disappearance, his behavior had grown erratic. He cried on camera. He hugged Laurie's parents. He posted missing person flyers. But then on the evening of July 20th, just one day after the search began, he was found wandering the streets in nothing but his sandals, reportedly having a breakdown. He was taken to the psychiatric ward of LDS Hospital for evaluation. Police couldn't question him further at that point. He was now a patient under a 72-hour hold for mental health observation. The public didn't yet know the details of the investigation. People still believed in the possibility of hope. Vigils were held. Friends and volunteers wore pink ribbons and continued their search efforts around the city. But behind the scenes, police were preparing for something no one wanted to believe. That Lori Hacking had not run away. That she had not been taken by a stranger. That she had died in her own home. And that the man who had sworn to love her, who had built a life on lies, was responsible. When Mark was released from psychiatric care, the tone changed quickly. He was arrested on August 2, 2004. He didn't fight it. He was charged with obstruction of justice. At first it was the only charge prosecutors could secure without a body. But the evidence was strong. The blood in the apartment, the missing mattress, the timing of the call to police, and perhaps most telling, the layers of deception that had unraveled since the search began. Mark had lied about college, about medical school, about applications, tuition, moving plans, everything. Friends described a man who seemed loving and normal, even doting. But investigators saw something else, a man desperate to preserve a crumbling fiction, even at unthinkable cost. The news sent ripples through the community. How could he have done this? How could a man who had once written Lori poems, who had stood beside her in family photos with such apparent devotion, have ended her life? The truth, when it emerged, was as simple as it was devastating. Mark confessed, but the body had still not been found. For Lori's parents, it was a kind of living nightmare. They now knew their daughter had died, that her husband had killed her, but they didn't know where she was. It was as though the world had swallowed her whole, leaving only absence and horror behind. The search shifted again. Not for a person, but for remains. Volunteers and law enforcement began searching a landfill in the Salt Lake Valley, combing through tons of compacted waste. It was a brutal, painstaking process, air thick with heat to stench unbearable, but they kept going. Day after day. On October 1, 2004, more than 2 months after Lori had vanished, a human torso was found in the landfill. It was Lori. No head, no hands, but enough to confirm her identity. The final pieces fell into place. Mark Hacking had shot his wife in the head with a .22 caliber rifle while she slept. He had wrapped her in garbage bags, disposed of her body in a dumpster behind a church, then disposed of the mattress and tried to clean the scene. And later he had walked barefoot into a furniture store, pretending everything was normal. He was charged with murder. He pled guilty. The courtroom during his sentencing was filled with quiet devastation. Lori's father spoke through tears. "There is a deep hole in our hearts," he said, "where Lori once was." Mark wept too. He offered an apology, but it did little to soften the enormity of what had been lost. He was sentenced to 6 years to life in prison. A wide range, because Utah law, at the time, did not carry a mandatory minimum for murder. The parole board would ultimately decide how long he stayed behind bars. Lori's family, and many in the community, pushed for reform. They succeeded. In 2005, Utah passed Lori's law, increasing the minimum sentence for first-degree murder from 5 years to 15. It wouldn't bring her back, but it made the punishment more closely reflect the crime. Today, Lori's name remains etched into the memory of Salt Lake City. Her friends and family still speak of her as a light, a woman with humor, intelligence, compassion. She had wanted to be a mother. She had wanted to support Mark through medical school. She had wanted a life full of small, beautiful things. Instead, her life was taken by a lie, by someone she trusted most. And the question that remained after all the facts were known was perhaps the simplest and the most haunting. Why? In the weeks after Lori's body was found, the rhythm of Salt Lake City seemed to shift in imperceptible ways. The leaves were just beginning to crisp at their edges, late August creeping into early fall. But for those who knew her family, friends, neighbors, co-workers, time was no longer measured in days or seasons. It was measured in before and after.
Before the lie, before the betrayal, before the loss no one could take back. Laurie's funeral was held on August 14, 2004. The service took place at the same church where she and Mark had once stood hand in hand, exchanging vows in front of family and friends. Now her parents walked down the aisle, not with joy, but with grief, so heavy it hung like lead on their shoulders. Her brothers sat stiffly in the front pews, struggling to hold themselves upright under the weight of disbelief. There were flowers, white lilies, her favorite, but they seemed pale and artificial in the presence of such raw sorrow. Hundreds attended. She had been the kind of person people remembered. Her co-workers at Wells Fargo recalled her attention to detail, her dependability, and the way she brought cookies to share on stressful days. Her college friends spoke of her boundless optimism. Laurie was the kind of woman who found meaning in the small corners of life: morning walks, handwritten notes, inside jokes, and quiet kindness. Her absence was deafening. People still spoke of the morning she vanished with a kind of reverence, as though it had split the world open. It hadn't just been a loss. It had been a deception that clung to everyone it touched, altering their sense of trust and safety. And at the center of it stood a man who had once been Laurie's entire future: Mark Hacking. His name was no longer spoken with warmth. It was a wound, a stain, a quiet horror sitting just beneath the surface. The man who had written Laurie love notes and promised her a life of family and laughter had turned out to be a stranger. Even now, long after his arrest and confession, people struggled to make sense of who he really was. In the psychiatric ward, where he had spent 2 days after her disappearance, Mark had spoken in fragments. He cried often. Nurses noted that he seemed distressed, though not entirely disconnected from reality. He asked repeatedly if anyone had found Laurie. He expressed shame, fear, remorse. And yet, when investigators finally pressed him after his release, what emerged was not a man suddenly overcome by delusion or mental illness. It was a man who had spent years lying. Mark had never graduated from the University of Utah, despite telling everyone he had. He had never applied to medical school, despite convincing his wife, their families and friends otherwise. The apartment was full of signs of their imminent move: boxes packed, utilities scheduled for shut-off, even a goodbye party planned. Laurie had believed they were starting over. She had believed he would become a doctor. She had believed with the full force of her love and trust in him. And in the quiet hours before dawn on July 19th, he had taken that belief and destroyed it. According to his confession, Laurie had confronted him about the lies. She had discovered the truth just days before she died. The confrontation had been calm, at first, then painful. She had not screamed. She had not left the apartment. But she had begun to process what it all meant, that the foundation of their marriage was not just cracked but false entirely. It was sometime around 1 a.m., long after the confrontation had ended, that Mark picked up a .22 caliber rifle they kept in the closet. She was asleep. He shot her once in the head. He then wrapped her body in garbage bags, cleaned the apartment with towels and household cleaner, and waited for morning. When the sun came up, he drove her remains to a dumpster behind a local church. From there they were picked up by waste disposal trucks and sent to the Salt Lake County landfill. The mattress, soaked with blood, was later discarded when he bought a new one later that same morning, barefoot, as if stunned, or as if he hadn't planned even that far ahead. It was not a crime of passion in the traditional sense. It was a crime of cowardice, of desperation, of a man whose lies had finally caught up to him, and who saw no way out other than to eliminate the one person who knew. What haunted those who knew Laurie most was the intimacy of the betrayal. She had loved him. In the months following the funeral, her parents became vocal advocates for criminal justice reform in Utah. Her father, Thelma Suarez, worked with lawmakers to introduce legislation that would prevent future killers from receiving such light sentences. At the time of Mark's guilty plea, The minimum sentence for first-degree murder in Utah was just 5 years. He had received 6 to life, but the possibility that he might one day be released after only a handful of years was intolerable to Laurie's family. They wanted to make sure no other family would have to face that same fear. By early 2005, their efforts bore fruit. The Utah state legislature passed a bill known informally as Laurie's Law, raising the minimum penalty for first-degree murder to 15 years before parole eligibility. It wasn't justice, they said, because justice would have been getting Laurie back. But it was a step toward accountability. Still, for Laurie's loved ones, the wound was far from healed. Her best friend Jennifer struggled for years with the memory of the final phone call they shared. Laurie had sounded hopeful, even cheerful. She had mentioned packing for the move, had talked about wanting to start a family once they were settled in North Carolina. There had been no sign that anything was wrong, no hint of the devastation that would follow just days later. Jennifer often wondered if she should have heard something, some note of unease or sadness in Laurie's voice. But there was nothing. That too was part of what made the crime so chilling, its silence. Laurie had not screamed. She had not called the police. She had not told her parents what she had discovered. She had kept it to herself, perhaps trying to protect the man she still loved, or perhaps trying to process the truth in her own time. It was possible she was planning to leave. Or maybe she was waiting to see if Mark would come clean. She never got the chance. Mark, for his part, remained largely silent after his conviction. He gave no interviews. He made no further public statements. He entered the Utah State Prison in Draper, and for the most part disappeared from public view. For the families on both sides, it was like a door slamming shut. His parents, devastated and confused, spoke rarely. Laurie's family continued to grieve in the open, sharing stories about her and urging others to recognize the signs of manipulation and deceit before it's too late. Her mother once said, "The saddest thing is not just that Laurie died, it's that she died believing in someone who did not deserve her." That sentence lingered like a slow exhale. It was not a story about a violent stranger, or a moment of madness. It was a story about someone close, someone trusted. And it made people look differently at the world around them, at relationships, at the quiet hidden truths that sometimes lie beneath the surface of a seemingly happy life. The apartment where Laurie had lived was eventually emptied, the lease terminated. Neighbors said they couldn't walk past it without feeling a weight in their chest. For months, the building remained quiet, as if holding its breath. Flowers were left outside her door, handwritten notes tucked into the corners of the windows. "You were loved. You are remembered. You did not deserve this." Time passed as it always does. But for those who loved Laurie Hacking, the story never really ended. It returned in dreams, in the sudden sound of a voice that wasn't hers, in the small and hollow moments of realization that she was gone forever. There were the birthdays she would never have, the children she would never meet, the life she was denied, and at the center of it all was a man who once promised to be her everything, and became the reason for her absence. Winter arrived slowly in Salt Lake City that year. Snow settled lightly on the Wasatch Mountains, and the chill crept into neighborhoods in a way that felt both natural and intrusive, because for those still grieving Laurie, nothing felt entirely real anymore. The holiday lights went up along South Temple Street. Shopkeepers strung garlands in windows, and strangers passed one another with muted nods. But the season carried a hollow note. The Hacking family home remained silent. It had once been a place where laughter came easily. Mark's parents, Janet and Douglas, were well known in the local LDS community, kind, generous people with reputations for integrity and faith. They had raised 3 boys with expectations of honesty, humility, and hard work. Laurie had become like a daughter to them. Her absence didn't just leave an empty chair at the table, it unspooled the very fabric of the family's identity. When news of Mark's lies had first broken, long before the full truth of the murder emerged, his parents had been among those most devastated. For days they struggled to understand what had happened. There were questions that had no answers, gaps in logic that could not be filled. How had a man raised in truth become so deeply entangled in deception? How long had it been going on? And why had no one seen it? There had been signs in retrospect, but they were subtle. Mark had always been charming. Not overtly so. He wasn't the loudest or most confident person in the room, but he was affable, warm and disarming. In high school he was known for making others feel at ease. He had a way of laughing at himself that made him seem honest. He worked hard. He said the right things. He followed the expected path. When he and Laurie met at the University of Utah, their relationship had moved quickly. Friends described them as inseparable. They studied together, attended church together, and seemed to orbit one another with a sense of deep comfort. Mark proposed not long after their first year of dating. By the time they were married, Laurie spoke of him as her best friend, her safe place, the person she trusted most in the world. That was what made it so hard to reconcile the man he became with the man she had loved. After the murder, therapists and journalists alike would speculate about Mark's behavior. Some believed he had developed a form of pathological lying, what clinicians sometimes refer to as pseudologia fantastica. Others suggested narcissistic traits. But no formal diagnosis was ever made public. Mark himself gave little insight. In prison he remained quiet. He was housed at the Utah State Prison in Draper, in the medium security section. Inmates who encountered him described him as polite, quiet, respectful. He attended religious services. He worked in the prison kitchen. He kept mostly to himself. There were no outbursts, no violent incidents, no breakdowns. But there was also no apology. He had confessed, yes, but beyond that he had offered no explanation. He did not speak to the media. He declined interview requests. The few letters he wrote to friends were short, distant, and emotionless. It was as if something had shut off inside him. For Laurie's family, that silence was unbearable. Her parents, Thelma and Geraldo Suarez, continued to speak publicly about their daughter. They showed up to interviews holding framed photos of her, laughing in the sunshine, hiking in the canyon, dressed up for Halloween. They wanted people to remember Laurie as she had been, not as a victim, not as a statistic, but as a person who had lived with purpose, even if her life had been cut short. The Lama in particular channeled her grief into advocacy. She spoke at domestic violence conferences, shared Laurie's story with university students, and urged young people, especially women, to trust their instincts. She never blamed Laurie for staying, for believing, for trusting, but she wanted others to see that emotional abuse, manipulation and deceit were not always loud. Sometimes, they whispered. She often said, "The most dangerous thing is not a man who hits you. It's a man who lies so well you no longer know what's true." And the community listened. In the years following Laurie's death, several initiatives were launched in her name. At the University of Utah, a memorial bench was placed in her honor. A scholarship was established for women in psychology, Laurie's intended field. At Wells Fargo, her former workplace colleagues began an annual volunteer day in her memory, packing care kits for local shelters and writing letters to victims of violence. Yet the ache of her absence never truly softened. Her younger brother Paul once said in an interview, "I thought time would make it easier, but sometimes I'll be driving or walking through a stall, and I'll see someone who looks like her from behind, and for half a second, I believe she's still here. Then it's gone, and it hurts just as much." The ripples of Laurie's murder reached far beyond her family. Friends, co-workers, neighbors, all found themselves re-evaluating the people in their lives. Trust no longer came easily. Relationships were second-guessed. People began noticing how often lies are told, not always with malice, but with an ease that can be chilling in retrospect. And Mark's lies had been so thorough. He had created fake emails from the medical school. He had scheduled a move-out date with their apartment complex. He had told family he needed money for textbooks. He had even gone so far as to drive to the supposed medical school campus with Laurie in the car, showing her buildings, pointing out landmarks, pretending as though their future was just over the horizon. For some it became clear that Mark had not only lied to Laurie, he had also been lying to himself. That idea was explored by Dr. Marilyn Harmon, a forensic psychologist, who consulted on the case for a local documentary. She explained that some individuals with chronic deceptive tendencies can blur the line between reality and fabrication. They begin to build a version of themselves that is more acceptable, more successful, more loved. And over time, maintaining that identity becomes a matter of survival, psychologically at least. But that explanation offered little comfort. It did not bring Laurie back. It did not change the fact that a woman had been killed in her sleep by the person she loved most in the world. As the 3rd anniversary of her death approached, the Suarez family organized a remembrance event. It was held in Memory Grove Park, a quiet tree-lined space nestled near the base of City Creek Canyon. Friends and strangers gathered to light candles, to write messages on paper lanterns, and to walk silently along the river trail that Laurie used to hike. There were no speeches, no cameras, just soft music and shared grief. A woman approached Thelma during the event, tears in her eyes. She explained that she had left an abusive relationship because of Laurie's story. That reading about what had happened had helped her recognize her own partner's lies. "She saved me," the woman whispered. "I never met her, but she saved me." The llama hugged her, and neither of them spoke for a long while. In that silence was something sacred. Laurie's story had not ended. It lived on in the choices people made, in the lives they saved, in the way they looked at the world. Her murder had been senseless, cruel, and deeply wrong, but her life had not been defined by that ending. It had been defined by everything that came before, the laughter, the kindness, the belief in goodness, even when it hurt. At the close of the evening, as the final lanterns drifted upward into the darkening sky, a breeze moved through the trees, rustling the leaves just enough to sound like a whisper. And for those who loved her, it felt like a reminder. Laurie was still with them, not in body, but in love, in legacy, in truth. And the man who had stolen her future would never again taste freedom, not because of revenge, but because of justice, and the quiet, unwavering conviction of the people she left behind. Time has a way of softening the sharpest edges of grief, but it doesn't erase them. For those closest to Laurie Hacking, the years that followed her murder were filled with quiet reckonings. Moments of unexpected sorrow, long silences over dinner, empty chairs at family gatherings. Her absence didn't just linger, it reshaped the lives she once moved through so easily. The media eventually moved on. The daily headlines that once bore her name faded into newer tragedies. But in Salt Lake City, particularly among those who knew her, or who came to know her through vigils, interviews, and headlines, Laurie's story settled into a deeper kind of memory. It became part of the local consciousness, a caution, a heartbreak, a name that still held weight, even when spoken softly. For her family, healing became a quiet, lifelong pursuit. The Lama and Geraldo Suarez returned to their home in Fullerton, California, where they had lived for many years before Laurie moved to Utah. It was a small tan stucco house on a quiet residential street, unremarkable in appearance, but now transformed by grief. In the months following Laurie's death, Thelma spent her days writing letters. She wrote to other grieving mothers, to lawmakers, to counselors and shelters. To Laurie, many of those letters were never sent. Some were stored in shoeboxes in the back of a closet. Others lined the margins of books, written between pages of devotionals or therapy guides. Writing for Thelma became a way of continuing to speak to her daughter, a way of saying all the things that had been stolen in a single senseless act. Her husband Araldo, more quiet by nature, threw himself into fixing things around the house. He built shelves, repaired doors, repainted their fence. It was the kind of work that gave shape to his sadness. When words failed him, and they often did, he would simply go outside, run his hands along the edges of Laurie's old gardening tools, and feel the weight of everything he could not control. They were not alone in their grief. Laurie's brothers, Paul and Gregory, found themselves struggling to make sense of the new reality. Paul, the youngest, took time away from college. He found himself haunted by nightmares of phone calls, unanswered, of Mark's face in the courtroom, of his sister's smile vanishing into the dark. Therapy helped, so did faith. But the wound remained open longer than he expected. It is not easy to lose someone to violence, but it is even harder when that violence comes at the hands of someone they loved. That perhaps was the most difficult truth to carry. Mark Hacking had not been a stranger, he had been part of the family. He had sat at their dinner table, prayed with them, gone on family trips. He had made Laurie laugh. They had trusted him, and in the end he had used that trust as a shield, hiding his unraveling behind a mask of affection. He had lied not just to Laurie, but to everyone around her. There were signs, as there always are in retrospect. Subtle inconsistencies. Shifts in tone. The way Mark avoided conversations about the future, or changed the subject when medical school came up. The excuses, the delays, the nervous laughter, but no one had wanted to see it. Not really, because they loved Laurie, and she loved him, and because sometimes the lie feels safer than the truth. After his sentencing, Mark faded into obscurity. He did not appeal his conviction. He granted no interviews. Occasionally, his name would surface in local news, usually related to legislation or an anniversary of the case, but otherwise, he vanished into the prison system. For many, that silence was a kind of mercy.
But for others, it left questions unanswered. What truly led him to kill Laurie that night? Was it planned? Was there an argument? Did he panic? Or had he known for days or weeks that it would end this way? These questions lingered in the quiet corners of conversations, never quite spoken aloud. Theories arose. Some believed he killed her to avoid being exposed. Others believed it was rage, a final act of desperation when the weight of his lies became unbearable. But Mark Hacking never gave them the truth. He confessed, yes, but only the broad strokes. He said he'd killed her in a moment of despair. He admitted to lying, to hiding her body, to calling in the false report. But he offered no emotional clarity, no apologies to her family, no explanation for how the man who had once vowed to protect her had become the person who destroyed her. Perhaps he didn't know himself. In 2008, 4 years after the trial, Utah passed a bill known informally as Laurie's Law, requiring those convicted of murder to serve at least 15 years before becoming eligible for parole. It was not retribution. Thelma Soares said in an interview, it was protection. It's for the next woman, she said, so that someone else's daughter doesn't pay the price for a system that forgives too quickly. The law passed with little resistance. In a small way, Laurie's story had changed something. It had turned grief into legislation, sorrow into prevention, and while no law could bring her back, it meant that her name would live on not just in mourning but in action. Years passed. Salt Lake City grew. New buildings rose downtown. The neighborhood where Laurie and Mark once lived changed. Tenants moved in and out, unaware of the history held within those walls. The old mattress store where Mark worked closed down. Time moved forward, but for those who remembered, the ache remained. Laurie's friends still gathered on her birthday. They met for brunch or hiked one of her favorite trails. They brought old photos and shared stories, not of the murder, not of Mark, but of Laurie. Her laugh, the way she never let anyone sit alone, the stories she told. The way she always carried 2 granola bars in her bag, one for herself and one for someone else who might be hungry. Those memories became sacred. At the University of Utah, the Laurie Hacking Memorial Scholarship grew each year, helping dozens of young women pursue careers in psychology. Some of them knew her story. Others learned about it only after receiving the award, but all of them carried a piece of her legacy forward, in their work, in their compassion, in the futures she had once dreamed of. Her death had taken much, but her life had given more. By the 10th anniversary of her murder, the world had changed in ways Laurie never lived to see, but her impact remained. There was a quiet resilience in the people who loved her, a refusal to let her name fade into tragedy, a decision to speak gently, but firmly, about the warning signs of emotional manipulation, to tell the truth, even when it hurt, to live in a way that honored the values Laurie had cherished: kindness, honesty, hope. On the 15th anniversary, Thelma and Paul returned to Memory Grove. It was late August, and the heat lingered into the evening. They brought flowers, sunflowers, Laurie's favorite, and a small wooden cross. They didn't speak much. They just sat together on the bench bearing her name, listening to the river and the distant hum of traffic. For a long time they said nothing. Then Paul spoke, his voice soft and steady. She should have been 44. Thelma nodded. She would have had kids. A dog, probably. Maybe even a garden. They sat a while longer, watching the light shift through the trees. In that quiet, the enormity of all that had been lost settled around them, but so did something else. Not peace, exactly, but presence. Laurie was gone, but she had not vanished. She remained in the kindness people showed one another, in the cautionary stories told to young couples, in the lives saved by shelters and advocates, and late-night Google searches that led someone somewhere to her name. Her story had traveled far beyond Utah. It had found its way into books, into classrooms, into whispered conversations between mothers and daughters, and always, it ended the same way. She trusted him. He lied to her. He killed her. And still she mattered. Even in death, Laurie Hacking mattered. And for those who loved her, that was everything. Whispers from the Pines. The disappearance of Jennifer Kesey in the early hours of January 23, 2006, the quiet suburb of Orlando, Florida, stirred with an unsettling silence. Jennifer Kesey, a 24-year-old woman living in a modest apartment complex, was about to vanish without a trace. Her disappearance would become one of the most confounding mysteries in the area, a case that even now resists clear answers, wrapped in shadows and whispers. Jennifer's life was ordinary in many ways. A college graduate, working in real estate, she was known among friends and family as kind and determined, someone who took pride in her work and cared deeply for those around her. She had recently moved into her condo at Lake Formosa, eager to settle into a fresh chapter. That morning, Jennifer had left for work as usual. Her routine was predictable, a short commute to her office and evenings spent unwinding quietly at home. But the day did not unfold as expected. Around mid-morning, her boss grew concerned when Jennifer failed to show up for a meeting. Attempts to reach her by phone went unanswered. No one could imagine why Jennifer would simply disappear. Hours later, her car was found parked at the apartment complex. Inside, the keys were in the ignition. Her purse and cell phone were missing, but there were no signs of struggle or forced entry. It was as if Jennifer had walked away from her life, vanished into the air itself. The police launched an intensive search. Neighbors were questioned. Surveillance footage was reviewed repeatedly, revealing tantalizing glimpses of a figure believed to be Jennifer walking near the complex. Yet, as days turned into weeks, hope dimmed. Speculation swirled. Was she the victim of foul play? Had she run away from something? Or was her disappearance a carefully orchestrated act? Each theory carried its own weight of unease, for none provided certainty. For Jennifer's family, the void left behind was unbearable, every unanswered question a fresh ache. The community watched closely, haunted by the idea that someone so young and vibrant could simply vanish without explanation. The case grew colder with time, but the echoes of that January day lingered, a haunting reminder of how quickly normal life can unravel into mystery. The morning after Jennifer Kesey was reported missing, The neighborhood awoke under a gray sky, the air crisp and still. Among the rows of neat town homes and quiet streets of the Lake Formosa community, the news settled like a shadow: Jennifer was gone. It was a place where people kept to themselves but noticed when someone didn't show up. Small acts, mail piling up, the absence of a car in a familiar driveway, sometimes spoke louder than words. That morning, Jennifer's neighbors began to feel the weight of something profoundly wrong. Detectives arrived at the scene quickly, and the search for clues began. Officers combed Jennifer's condo with gentle precision, aware of the growing fear that the ordinary had suddenly turned sinister. The home was neat, quiet, and offered little in the way of answers. Nothing seemed out of place except for what was missing: her purse and cell phone. In the weeks that followed, the police turned to technology to shed light on the mystery. Jennifer's car was a key piece of the puzzle. Found in the community's parking lot, it bore no signs of forced entry or damage. The doors were locked. Inside, a small detail caught investigators' attention: the keys remained in the ignition. This suggested two possible scenarios, both unsettling. Jennifer might have intended to return to her car shortly after stepping away, or someone else could have moved it. The thought that someone could have entered the condo, taken her essentials, and driven off with the car later, or abandoned it there, created a gnawing tension. Perhaps more disturbing was the absence of security footage from the complex. In a community where cameras overlooked entrances and parking areas, the footage from the day of Jennifer's disappearance was frustratingly incomplete. Some cameras were malfunctioning, others captured blurred images that hinted at a shadowy figure, but nothing definitive. One piece of footage that investigators focused on showed a woman, believed to be Jennifer, walking near the complex late that night. The figure was alone, dressed in dark clothing, and carrying a bag. She moved with purpose but without haste. The timestamp was vague, and the quality poor, yet it was the last known sighting of Jennifer. Over time, the police interviewed dozens of people: friends, family, co-workers, neighbors. They pieced together a timeline of her final hours, but every answer seemed to lead to more questions. Jennifer had left work around noon that day, according to colleagues. She called her boyfriend to say she was feeling overwhelmed, a detail that suggested emotional stress but no immediate danger. Her last known phone call was made to her mother, yet there was no indication she planned to vanish. Her employer described her as dependable, someone who never missed work without a clear reason. Her friends said she had no history of disappearing or secretive behavior. This disappearance didn't fit the pattern of a voluntary escape. One lead took the investigation into the shadows of crime and danger. Rumors surfaced about a possible stalker. A man, known to have shown an unhealthy interest in Jennifer, was questioned repeatedly. His alibi held, and no evidence linked him directly to her disappearance, but the fear that someone had been watching Jennifer's every move lingered in the background. As the search grew desperate, law enforcement enlisted the help of search and rescue teams, canine units, and volunteers. They scoured wooded areas and nearby lakes, searching for any trace of Jennifer's presence beyond the apartment complex. But the woods were thick, and the winter cold harsh. Snow softened footprints. Tracks were erased by wind. Neighbors took shifts at the edges of the community, scanning darkened streets and alleyways with flashlights, hoping for a sign, a dropped glove, a footprint, anything. The emotional toll was profound. Jennifer's mother, Donna, was devastated. She appeared at every press conference, clutching photographs of her daughter, voice breaking as she pleaded for answers. Her face became familiar to news viewers across Florida, a symbol of a family's hope hanging by a thread. "Please," Donna said softly during one televised appeal, "if anyone knows anything, please come forward. My daughter is out there somewhere. We need to find her." The family's anguish was raw and constant. Days blurred into nights. The silence where Jennifer's voice once was echoed like a void in every corner of their lives. Meanwhile, the media descended on the story with a hunger for details that were frustratingly scarce. Reporters camped outside the apartment complex, interviewing neighbors and authorities, trying to piece together the puzzle. The story of a young woman vanishing without a trace captured public fascination and fear, but the facts remained elusive. As weeks passed, the case grew cold, tips slowed,
Leads dried up. The police maintained a presence, but began shifting resources to other investigations. Yet despite the absence of answers, the mystery deepened. Months later, an anonymous caller contacted police with a cryptic message: "She's near the lake." Investigators searched Lake Formosa and its surroundings but found nothing. The call was never traced. Another strange development emerged when a neighbor reported hearing unusual noises in the parking garage late at night. Sounds of muffled voices and a vehicle starting, but nothing else was found. Some in the community whispered theories about human trafficking, about a planned abduction, about a hidden life Jennifer might have kept from them all. Friends and family refused to give up hope. Jennifer's boyfriend, who had been a steady presence in her life, became an advocate for the search. He spoke of her warmth and the dreams they shared. His interviews revealed a man grappling with confusion and pain, trying to make sense of a future rewritten by loss. In the months that followed, small memorials appeared near the community's entrance. Flowers, photographs, candles. They were reminders that behind the headlines and rumors was a young woman who had been loved deeply and was sorely missed. The police, too, continued to revisit the case periodically. Advances in forensic science, new tips, and the occasional re-examination of evidence kept the hope alive that someday, the truth would surface. For those who knew Jennifer, her disappearance was not just a mystery, it was a fracture in their sense of safety and trust. The idea that a person could vanish in broad daylight, in a community built on neighborly care, was deeply unsettling. Her story became a haunting caution, a reminder that darkness can sometimes hide in the most familiar places. As winter thawed into spring, the streets of Lake Formosa returned to their usual quiet rhythms. But for Jennifer's family, the absence was a constant ache, a space waiting to be filled, and for the world watching, the question remained: what happened to Jennifer Kesse? The months following Jennifer Kesse's disappearance were marked by an exhausting cycle of hope, frustration, and unanswered questions. As the seasons shifted from winter's grey chill to the tentative warmth of spring, the search for Jennifer extended beyond the borders of the Lake Formosa community into the wider Central Florida region. Law enforcement, the family, and volunteers tirelessly pursued every lead, but the trail remained maddeningly cold. One of the most haunting aspects of the case was the absence of any clear motive or explanation. There were no ransom demands, no notes, no messages left behind. Jennifer's personal belongings, aside from the purse and cell phone, remained undisturbed. It was as if she had simply evaporated into the Florida landscape. The police continued to focus on gathering and analyzing every shred of information that might shed light on what had happened during those critical hours in late January. Detectives reviewed traffic cameras, spoke again with neighbors, and followed up on tips that trickled in from the public. Some were promising, others led to dead ends, and many were simply echoes of the desperation felt by everyone involved. Among these leads, one particular tip sent investigators to the south side of Orlando, near Lake Underhill. A woman reported seeing a vehicle matching the description of Jennifer's green 1998 Saturn cell parked near an abandoned construction site on the night of her disappearance. The witness said the car's lights flickered on and off, and a man was seen walking nearby, though the details were unclear. Despite an exhaustive search of the area, no trace of Jennifer or her belongings was found. This lead highlighted an unsettling possibility: that Jennifer might have been abducted and held somewhere unknown to her friends and family. Such a scenario sent waves of fear through the community and intensified media scrutiny. Jennifer's family clung to hope, though the weight of uncertainty pressed heavily on their hearts. Her mother, Donna, became a tireless advocate, participating in interviews, organizing community searches, and attending missing persons conferences. Her father, John, tried to maintain strength for the family while quietly grappling with his own anguish. The family's resilience became a focal point of the story, their love and determination a stark contrast to the elusive nature of the case. In interviews, they described Jennifer not only as a missing person, but as a daughter, sister, and friend, whose absence was felt in every corner of their lives. Among the friends closest to Jennifer, the pain was equally profound. Some spoke of the last time they saw her, recalling her laughter, her worries and the plans they had made for the future. Others struggled with guilt, wondering if there was something they missed, some sign that could have warned them. One of Jennifer's closest friends, Rachel, shared how Jennifer had confided in her about feeling uneasy in the days leading up to her disappearance. She mentioned a man who had been making unwanted advances, and how she felt watched. Rachel urged Jennifer to be cautious, but neither anticipated what would come next. Law enforcement took this lead seriously, investigating any connections between Jennifer and known offenders or persons of interest in the area. Yet the search for a suspect remained frustratingly inconclusive. Amid this uncertainty, the media coverage of the case evolved. Initial headlines described a hopeful search for a young woman who had vanished without explanation. Over time, the tone shifted toward the grim reality of a cold case with little evidence and few answers. Journalists and bloggers alike speculated on every angle. Was Jennifer a victim of a random crime? Had she planned to start a new life? Was there something in her past that explained her disappearance? Some theories were compassionate, others veered toward conspiracy, but none were backed by solid proof. One particularly disturbing theory proposed by some online forums involved human trafficking, a hidden crime that preys on vulnerable individuals. Given Jennifer's age and the nature of her disappearance, this speculation found traction among some advocates. However, law enforcement found no direct evidence linking Jennifer's case to trafficking rings. The gap between public fascination and investigative certainty created a fog around Jennifer's story, blurring fact and fiction in ways that made the truth harder to discern. Meanwhile, the police quietly revisited the initial evidence, searching for overlooked clues or new technology that might unlock the mystery. DNA analysis and other forensic techniques had advanced since 2006, offering some hope that previously collected samples could be re-examined. In the quiet moments of the investigation, officers reflected on the case's unusual nature. Missing person cases often involve patterns, arguments, financial troubles, documented threats, but Jennifer's life seemed to lack these clear markers. Her disappearance was not accompanied by signs of distress or conflict, deepening the mystery. For the community of Lake Formosa, life moved forward, but the absence of Jennifer Kessie lingered like a wound that refused to heal. Her apartment remained empty, a silent monument to loss. Occasionally, neighbors reported seeing lights flickering or shadows moving near the complex late at night, feeding a quiet unease that the past had not yet released its hold. Jennifer's disappearance also led to conversations about safety, privacy, and the hidden dangers lurking even in seemingly secure neighborhoods. Residents began advocating for improved security measures, better lighting, and increased surveillance, hoping to prevent such tragedies from happening again. Beyond the immediate circle of family and community, Jennifer's case became a somber reminder of the fragility of life and the unsettling reality that some questions may never find answers. Her story was shared in missing persons databases, in podcasts dedicated to unsolved cases, and in quiet conversations between those who knew her or who had heard of the strange disappearance that had rocked Orlando. As the years passed, anniversaries of her disappearance were marked with vigils and renewed calls for information. The family maintained a website dedicated to Jennifer, sharing updates and memories in the hope that someone, somewhere, might come forward. Yet despite the passing of time, the core mystery remained intact. Where had Jennifer gone that cold January night? What had happened after she left her workplace, walked through the parking lot, and disappeared into the darkness? The lack of resolution was a heavy burden. It shaped the lives of those left behind, coloring their memories and reshaping their futures. For Jennifer's parents, the waiting was unbearable. Every day without answers was a day of mourning and hope intertwined. They lived with the paradox of grief and expectation, never giving up on the possibility that one day their daughter might be found. For the investigators who had worked on the case, Jennifer's disappearance was a haunting puzzle that challenged their skills and their faith in closure. It was a reminder that sometimes, despite best efforts and intentions, the darkness does not easily give up its secrets. And for those listening to this story, Jennifer's fate remains unknown. a question mark lingering in the quiet spaces of the night, a whisper in the pines that refuses to fade. Years passed since Jennifer Kesey vanished from the quiet streets of Lake Formosa, yet the question of her fate lingered in the collective consciousness of those who knew her, those who searched for her, and those who found themselves drawn to the mystery of her disappearance. Time did little to ease the ache of absence. It only deepened the silence that stretched between the past and the unknown. Jennifer's family held on to memories with fierce tenderness. Her mother, Donna, often spoke of Jennifer's kindness, her laughter that could light a room, and the small everyday moments they shared. The smell of fresh coffee in the morning, a favorite song on the radio, a text message that arrived unexpectedly. These fragments of ordinary life became precious relics, reminders that their daughter had been vibrant, loved, and irreplaceable. John, her father, quietly preserved Jennifer's room as it had been, a sanctuary frozen in time. He would sometimes sit there, alone, turning over small objects, a book she cherished, a piece of jewelry, a photograph, and in those moments, he felt the presence of the daughter he had lost, but never stopped loving. Their grief was not linear. It ebbed and flowed, sometimes overwhelming, sometimes subdued, but always present. The unanswered questions, the not knowing, gnawed at their souls. Jennifer's disappearance also left a ripple effect beyond her family. Her friends, community members, and even the officers who had worked the case felt the haunting weight of a story that defied closure. Detective Mike Puccio, one of the lead investigators, described the case as one of the most perplexing and heartbreaking of his career. Despite exhaustive efforts, the absence of concrete leads left the investigation suspended in uncertainty. The intangible nature of Jennifer's vanishing, without struggle, without trace, challenged conventional understanding of missing person cases. Theories abounded, but none offered certainty. Some speculated that Jennifer had been abducted by someone she trusted, someone who knew her routines and vulnerabilities. Others wondered if she had encountered a random act of violence or crime of opportunity. There were whispers of a planned disappearance, a voluntary escape from pressures or fears that only she understood. Yet the known facts painted a picture of a young woman who was careful, connected, and hopeful. Her friends remembered her as someone who planned for the future, someone who talked about dreams rather than despair. One particularly poignant moment came years later when a new tip surfaced. An individual contacted authorities, claiming to have seen Jennifer alive months after her disappearance, in a town several hundred miles away. The tip led to a search, interviews, and renewed hope, but ultimately no confirmation. The call stirred emotions, a mixture of hope, skepticism, and sadness. For Jennifer's family, every glimmer of possibility was a lifeline. No matter how faint, they continued to advocate, to speak, to remember. In the broader context, Jennifer's case served as a catalyst for discussions about the vulnerabilities faced by young women and the challenges of missing persons investigations. It highlighted the critical importance of timely response, community vigilance, and the complexities that surround disappearances. Lake Formosa itself was changed by the event. Once a quiet neighborhood where neighbors exchanged greetings and trusted in the safety of their streets, it became a place marked by caution and unresolved grief. Security cameras were installed, community watches organized, and the spirit of neighborliness mixed with a vigilant awareness of the unseen dangers. The disappearance prompted lawmakers and advocacy groups in Florida to push for improved protocols for missing persons cases, including better resource allocation and technological enhancements in investigation methods. Despite these efforts, Jennifer's fate remains a mystery. Her story is not one of a resolved crime or a neatly closed chapter. It is a lingering question, an open wound, a testament to the fragile line between presence and absence. It is also a story of love that endures beyond the physical, of memory as a refuge, and of hope that refuses to fade entirely. The quiet roads of Lake Formosa hold echoes of Jennifer's laughter, shadows of her footsteps, and the persistent whisper of her name carried by the wind. And for those who continue to search, to remember, and to hope, Jennifer Kesey remains more than a missing person. She is a daughter, a friend, a woman whose life, though cut abruptly short in its narrative, continues to resonate deeply in the hearts of many.